She was 23 and emptied. No lease, no family promise, no clean name left to stand under. Just one canvas tote and $5 she had saved by skipping supper for 3 cold nights. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten cedar Salmon Smokehouse near Blind Slough in Clatsop County, Oregon, where one road had fallen off county visitor maps by 1998. The roof had opened like a bad seam. The back wall leaned toward the salt marsh. The county said the building had been closed since 1987 and was scheduled for demolition the following winter. But what nobody knew was that beneath the bottom boards of the oak curing vat, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 56 years, was a waterproof box holding $48,000 and a kept salt that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Freya Maren Vale had been disappearing her whole life without knowing it. She had learned the art before she had words for it. In grocery aisles, she stood where carts would not have to move around her. In school photographs, she tucked her chin and let taller children fill the center. At church suppers, she carried casseroles from the kitchen door to the folding tables, then slipped back into the steam and dishwater before anyone could say whether there was room for one more at the table. Her childhood had been measured in rented rooms along the wet shoulder of the Oregon coast, places where the windows sweated in winter and the carpets carried the odor of somebody else's storms. She knew the sound of landlords knocking with 2 knuckles. She knew how a refrigerator looked when it held mustard, half an onion, and a carton of milk turned sideways to hide how little was left. Her mother, Celia, worked wherever the tide of wages happened to rise for a month or two. She cleaned motel rooms in Seaside, packed shrimp in Warrenton, washed aprons for a bakery that paid cash on Fridays. Celia had once been pretty in a bright, coastal way, all copper hair and quick wrists, but labor had drawn the light inward. By the time Freya was 12, her mother's laughter came mostly when other people were listening. Of her father, Freya had little more than a photograph taken beside a net boat, his eyes narrowed against sunlight, one hand resting on a coil of rope. His name had been Elias Vale. He had drowned before Freya learned to read, crossing the bar in weather that men later called foolish, though none of them said it where Celia could hear. The Columbia River does not enter the Pacific politely. It wrestles its way out, carrying fresh water, silt, old timber, and the names of men who believed they knew the channel. After Elias was gone, Celia began taking Freya south on weekends to visit the one person who seemed to understand that grief needed something to do with its hands. Ingrid Sorensen was Celia's aunt by marriage, though Freya never called her anything but Aunt Ingrid. She lived in a gray house outside Astoria, with a shed that smelled of cedar, brine, coffee grounds, and rope fiber warmed by sun. Ingrid had been born in 1939, the daughter of a Norwegian net mender and a Chinook woman who cured fish with such patience that neighbors said she could hear salt working. Her hands were blunt and exact. Her hair, when Freya first remembered it, was already white and pinned without decoration at the back of her head. Every Saturday morning, Celia left Freya there just after 8, then drove away to errands she did not explain. Freya would stand on the back step with one shoe untied and watch Ingrid carry a blue enamel basin to the shed. "Come on, child," Ingrid would say. "The fish will not wait for us to become ready." Those weekends became Freya's first true schooling. Ingrid taught her how to rinse salmon without bruising the flesh. She taught her that salt was not only a flavor but a clock, that brown sugar softened the edge, that juniper must be used like a secret and not like a decoration. She showed her the difference between alder smoke and cedar smoke, between heat that cooked and heat that persuaded. They would stand together before the smokehouse door, Ingrid with a hand on the iron latch, Freya beside her holding a notebook already stained at the corners. A draft had to be opened by the width of 2 fingers when the wind came from the west. Coals were never to be trusted simply because they glowed. A fish could look firm and still need another hour if the morning fog sat heavy in the rafters. At noon, they ate rye bread, pickled onions, and pieces of cooled salmon on wax paper. Then Ingrid brought out the netting needles. She taught Freya to mend a tier by following the original pattern, not by closing the hole in panic. Not measure, pull. Not measure, pull. The twine rasped against Freya's fingers until her skin hardened in narrow lines. On rainy days, when the gutters overflowed and the river disappeared behind a silver curtain, Ingrid let her sort the tins on the high shelf. There were labels written in a severe hand. Bay salt, birch toothpicks, grandmother's cure, alder chips, North Stack. Freya loved those labels because each one meant someone had cared enough to be exact. Ingrid never filled the air with comfort. She did not say life would be fair or that pain would pass if a person waited. She believed in wool socks, sharp knives, paid bills, and telling the truth before it fermented. Yet there was a gentleness in the order of her days. When Freya broke a jar, Ingrid handed her a broom. When Freya cried because Celia had forgotten to come until nearly dark, Ingrid gave her a mug of broth and said nothing about forgiveness. The sentence Freya remembered most came when she was 14, after she had ruined a whole side of coho by turning the heat too high. Ingrid had lifted the blackened fish with both hands, studied the damage, and set it aside for the chickens. Anything worth keeping must be tended slowly, she said. At the time, Freya understood it as a rule about fish. Later, she heard the rest of it in the spaces between jobs. Rooms and people. Slowly did not mean weekly. Slowly meant with attention. It meant refusing the cheap hurry that ruined what hunger had worked hard to bring home. When Ingrid died in the spring of Freya's 17th year, rain came for 9 days without a clean break. Celia wore black to the service and kept her face turned toward the window. The church smelled of wet coats and lilies. Freya sat behind a cousin she barely knew and watched the minister's mouth move over facts that seemed too thin for the woman who had taught her how smoke should move. Afterward, there should have been objects. The blue enamel basin, the handwritten cure book, the copper thermometer with a cracked ivory face, the netting needles, the small tins from the high shelf. Ingrid had promised that one day Freya would have them, not with ceremony, but in the careful way she promised practical things. But grief makes an opening for those who know how to carry boxes. By the time Celia and Freya reached the house 3 days after the funeral, the shed had been stripped. A nephew from Tacoma had taken the tools, saying they were family property. A neighbor had claimed the alder stacks before weather got to them. The cure book had vanished with the kitchen table. Nobody admitted taking the netting needles. Nobody remembered the tins. Freya walked through the bare shed and found only a crescent of salt on the floor where one container had leaked. She knelt and touched it with 2 fingers. It had hardened in the damp, white and gray at the edges, ordinary to anyone else. To her it looked like the outline left behind when a body is carried from a bed. Celia remarried the next year. His name was Martin Greer, and he entered their lives with clean boots and a salesman's courtesy. He managed equipment accounts for a cannery supply company, which meant he knew invoices, men with trucks, and the power of a calm voice in an office. He never shouted. That was part of what made rooms change when he stepped into them. Martin liked surfaces polished. He liked bills stacked at right angles. He liked Celia's hair pinned neatly and Freya's work shoes kept outside. He called Freya the girl long after he had married her mother, not cruelly, but with a settled distance that was worse than anger. He could make her feel temporary while passing the butter. Under his roof, Freya learned to take up less space than ever. She washed her plate before anyone asked. She left no books on chairs. She kept her pay stubs folded in a coffee tin beneath her mattress because Martin believed young women were careless with money, and Celia believed whatever made the evening smooth. At 19, Freya rented a narrow stall at the weekend fish market in Astoria. It stood between a honey vendor and a man who sold hand-tied flies. She called it Vale's Salt and Smoke. Though the sign was cardboard at first, black marker on a piece of flattened packing crate. She sold smoked salmon collars, salt cod cakes, jars of pickled herring, and little paper cones of candied salmon ends that children bought with quarters. The work nearly saved her. She rose at 3, took deliveries before dawn, kept 2 ice chests under the folding table, and learned the names of people who came back. A retired schoolteacher liked her salmon less sweet. A deckhand wanted extra pepper. A woman with silver bracelets bought scraps for chowder every Thursday and never asked why Freya looked tired. Then Nolan Ash came by the stall one foggy Saturday carrying a crate of lemons he said a restaurant had refused. He was 28, handsome in the harmless way of men who know mirrors have been kind to them. He admired the sign. He admired the cure. He admired the way Freya wrapped fish in butcher paper, folding the ends tightly so no oil escaped. He said he could help make the business real. At first, that meant ordinary help. He built shelves. He printed labels. He knew someone with a used glass display case. He spoke to customers easily while Freya worked behind the table, and people mistook his confidence for proof. Within 5 months, his name was on the vendor license. Within 8, he was calling himself her fiancé. Within 11, she had signed papers he placed before her while she was cleaning knives, trusting his finger where it tapped. The debt came dressed like an envelope. On November 14, 2022, a man in a brown coat arrived at the market before opening. He had Nolan's handwriting copied poorly across a contract, Freya's signature beneath it, and a patience that had nothing to do with kindness. Nolan was gone by then. His phone gave only a recorded voice. The display case had been emptied. The bank account held $31.19. The loan, taken at an interest rate that made the numbers breed in the margins, named Freya as the responsible partner. By noon, the market manager had changed the padlock on her stall. That evening, she went to Celia's house because there was nowhere else to go. Rain slicked the porch boards. Her canvas tote held 2 shirts, Ingrid's photograph, and the last clean apron from the stall. Through the front window she could see Celia at the dining table, hands folded around a mug, not drinking. Martin opened the door before Freya knocked a second time. He held a cardboard produce box against his hip. In it were her winter coat, 3 books, a chipped mug, and the coffee tin from under the mattress, opened and empty except for a paperclip. Behind him, Celia stared at the steam rising from her mug. Freya looked at her mother first, then at the box. Martin set it on the porch between them. You signed it. Freya. There is no place. 8 words. Not loud. Not hurried. Just placed there like a receipt. Celia lifted one hand, not toward her daughter, but toward the collar of her own sweater. She pinched the fabric closed at her throat, as if a draft had entered. Her eyes did not rise. In that silence, Freya understood that betrayal did not always slam a door. Sometimes it sat at a table and let another person speak. Freya picked up the box. The rain had already begun to soften one corner. She did not beg. There are times when asking becomes a way of handing someone the knife twice. She stepped backward, feeling the porch stair with her heel, and carried the box into the wet evening. For 6 weeks, she lived by subtraction. First went the storage unit in Warrenton, because the fee was due and the man behind the counter would not hold it without payment. She stood under a security light and chose what could fit in the canvas tote. Ingrid's photograph. 2 pairs of socks. The apron. A pocket knife. The rest remained behind the orange metal door until the company sold it to recover rent. Then went the phone service. She slept one night behind a laundromat in Seaside where dryer vents blew warm air for 12 minutes at a time. The next morning, she bought coffee for $1 and asked for the cup to be filled again with hot water. She rode a county bus to Tillamook because someone at a shelter said there might be cannery work, but the season had turned thin and the supervisor would not meet her eyes. In Tillamook, she slept in the back pew of a church whose basement smelled of floor wax and potatoes. A woman named Ruth gave her a folded quilt and did not ask for the whole story. Freya told her she was headed north again. Ruth packed 2 boiled eggs in a paper sack and added a napkin without making a lesson of it. Her money became a set of exact numbers she carried like weather. $74 after the storage fee. $58 after bus fare. $41 after a pair of dry gloves from a thrift store in Garibaldi. $23 after 3 nights in a hostel room in Portland, where the radiator clicked all night and a woman in the next bunk cried into a towel. $18 after she mailed copies of the forged papers to a legal aid office and paid extra for tracking because it was all the proof she had. $12 after soup. $9 after socks. $7 after a bus back toward the river. The cities passed through her body as textures. Portland was concrete rain and library heat. Longview was diesel, wet paper, and the smell of the mill. Cathlemet was a bench under an awning where she slept sitting up. One hand looped through the handles of her tote. Astoria, when she returned to it, was gulls crying above pilings and the enormous gray mouth of the Columbia opening toward the sea. She avoided the market. She avoided the street where her sign had once hung. She walked with her head covered and her hands in her sleeves, not because anyone was hunting her, but because shame can make even an ordinary sidewalk feel like a room full of witnesses. On the 41st day, she counted $5.38 in the women's restroom of the Astoria Public Library. The library stood warm and square against the weather, with carpet that muffled footsteps and windows looking toward streets washed clean by rain. Freya had come in to dry her socks under a table and read job postings on a public computer. The machine gave her 45 minutes. She used 32 applying for dishwashing work, and the rest staring at the screen after it logged her out. Beside the copier, a corkboard held community notices. Piano lessons. Lost cat. Estate sale in Svensson. Free pallets. A church supper. Someone had pinned a clipping from the county's surplus listings, cut crookedly from a newspaper and marked with a yellow highlighter that had begun to fade. Condemned cedar smokehouse structure. Former fish curing shed. Blind Slough vicinity. Clatsop County nuisance transfer. Quit claim only. No utilities certified. No occupancy warranty. Buyer assumes demolition liability. Minimum consideration $5. Below that, in smaller type, was the address of the clerk's office and a deadline 2 days away. Freya read it once standing. Then she read it again with one hand on the copier to steady herself. $5 was not a price. It was a warning. A building sold for $5 was not being offered so much as handed off. Like a soaked coat, nobody wanted to carry another mile. The words condemned and liability had weight. No utility certified meant cold. No occupancy warranty meant she could be removed as quickly as she entered. Demolition liability meant the county wanted the problem to become someone else's paperwork. Yet the clipping held one word that reached through all the others. Smokehouse. Not restaurant. Not apartment. Not room. Not shelter. Smokehouse. Freya touched the yellowed paper, where the highlighter had crossed the line. Beneath her fingers, she felt the ghost of Ingrid's shed, the blue enamel basin, the copper thermometer that had vanished, the patient way heat changed fish when a person did not rush it. She could almost hear the small click of Ingrid's knife on the cutting board, the measured pull of twine through netting, the old woman's voice saying that the fish would not wait for readiness. The rain pressed softly at the library windows. Freya removed the clipping from the corkboard and carried it to a table in the corner. She smoothed it flat with both palms. Her tote sat at her feet, holding nearly all she owned. Her socks were still damp. Her stomach had tightened into the careful silence that comes when hunger stops complaining and becomes part of the furniture. She counted the coins again. $5.38. A bus to the county office would cost too much. Coffee would cost too much. A roll from the bakery would cost too much. She folded the clipping along its original crease and slipped it into Ingrid's photograph, face to face, as if the dead might read what the living could not yet bear to hope. By late afternoon, she had made her decision with the same deliberate care she once used to set a draft vent. She would walk to the clerk's office before it closed the next day. She would ask what the words meant. She would not pretend to understand more than she did. If the smokehouse was only a ruin, then at least she would have spent her last $5 on a door no one else had wanted, and there was a kind of honesty in that. That night, she slept behind a boat repair shop under an overhang that smelled of resin, old rope, and tide mud. Rain ticked in the gutters. Somewhere in the dark, a loose halyard struck a mast again and again, patient as a clock. Freya tucked the clipping inside her coat. By morning, the paper had warmed against her ribs, and the river was waiting. By first light, she had already crossed 2 blocks of wet pavement and 1 alley silvered with fish scales. A story awoke slowly in weather like that. The town did not rise all at once, but by layers. A bakery window warming before the sidewalks filled, a delivery truck coughing behind a cafe, a gull standing on the peak of a trash bin as if it owned the whole gray morning. She walked with the cardboard box flattened and tied to the outside of her tote, because dry cardboard could be used beneath, the hip bones at night, and a person who had slept on concrete learned to preserve anything with even a little mercy in it. The clerk's office did not open until 9. She had slept badly under the boat shop overhang, waking each time a truck passed through a puddle or the wind drove rain sideways beneath the eaves. At 5, a man in orange waterproof pants found her there while unlocking the side door. He looked at her, then at the tote, then at the rain. "Office opens at 7, he said, nodding toward the marina. He did not ask her to leave immediately. That was a kindness. She gathered herself before he could change his mind, crossed the damp gravel, and spent 2 hours in the marina, restroom washing her face with cold water and drying her hair under a hand dryer that worked in tired bursts. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a narrow face made narrower by hunger, eyes rimmed red, hair pinned with 2 bent bobby pins, and a woman still trying to appear orderly before strangers who held paper. At 9, she was standing outside the county building. The walk from the waterfront up toward the courthouse climbed more than she expected. Her calves burned by the second hill. Rainwater ran along the curb in quick little streams, carrying cedar needles, a cigarette butt, and 1 yellow leaf that turned over and over in the gutter. She passed the Liberty Theater marquee, a pawn shop with fishing rods in the window, a bakery cooling racks of cinnamon rolls behind glass, a marine supply store whose door stood propped open with a rubber boot, and a pharmacy where a cardboard snowman had already been taped inside the display, though Thanksgiving had not yet arrived. The town was not unfriendly. It was worse than that. It was busy with lives already arranged. At a corner, a school bus side open and children climbed aboard with backpacks bumping their coats. Across the street, two men in black rain jackets drank coffee beside a pickup with a dented tailgate. Someone laughed. Someone dropped keys. Ordinary sounds moved around her without attaching themselves. The county clerk's office sat inside a low public building with brick darkened by years of weather and a flag snapping in the cold. The lobby smelled of damp wool, printer toner, floor wax, and old paper warmed by radiators. A bulletin board held notices about burn permits, property taxes, boat ramp closures, and one printed warning about winter king tides. She stood just inside the door, long enough for the warmth to reach her hands. There were 3 service windows. At the first, a man argued about a boundary line. At the second, a woman renewed a business filing while bouncing a baby against one shoulder. The third window was empty except for a brass bell, a plastic pen chained to the counter, and a nameplate that read Marjorie Klein, Senior Wrecker's Clerk. Behind the glass, filing cabinets rose in patient rows. Some were beige, some green, all with label slots darkened by fingerprints. A wall clock clicked above a framed photograph of the county courthouse taken in a year when the cars outside still had broad chrome grills. Somewhere in the back, a copier began its careful mechanical breathing. Marjorie Klein appeared carrying a stack of folders pressed against her chest. She was a compact woman in her late 60s, with iron-gray hair cut blunt at her jaw and reading glasses hanging from a beaded cord. Her cardigan was the color of wet clay. One shoulder sat slightly higher than the other, as if decades of lifting record books had taught her body to compensate. She set the folders down, aligned them by tapping the bottom edge on the counter, and looked through the glass, with the unhurried attention of someone who had watched many people arrive, hoping a form would become a ladder. "Can I help?" The clipping came out of the coat with a softness that made it seem older than it was. The clerk read it without touching it at first. Then she opened the little half-door beside the window and motioned toward a chair at the side desk. "You had better sit down." The chair was wooden, not comfortable, but it held. Marjorie brought the clipping with her and lowered herself into the chair across from the desk. She did not ask whether the young woman had money. She did not ask why her cuffs were damp or why her tote looked heavy enough to hurt. She put on her reading glasses, took a folder from the stack, and spoke in a tone that made every word sound measured before release. "You understand this is a quitclaim transfer?" "Yes." "Mom." "You understand the county is not warranting the condition?" "Yes." "Mom." "You understand there is no certified water, no certified power, and no approved septic record attached?" "Yes." "Mom." "You understand the structure has been posted?" "Yes." "Mom." "You understand that if the building falls, burns, attracts trespassers, or must be removed, the county will not be responsible for your costs?" There was a pause. The clerk lowered her glasses a little, not with impatience, but with the grave courtesy of letting a person hear the last warning in the room. "Yes, Mom," she said again. Marjorie's eyes rested on her for another moment. Then she opened the folder. The papers were thicker than she expected, not because the property was worth much, but because a place no one wanted still required a trail. There was a parcel number typed beside an address that sounded less like a home than a set of instructions. There was a map showing a narrow rectangle near Blind Slough, crossed by a drainage ditch and bordered on one side by county land. There was a photograph printed in poor black and white. The smokehouse crouched beneath trees. Roof sagging, signboard hanging at one corner like a loose tooth. The photograph made her breathe in without meaning to. Marjorie noticed. No. Mom. You have family out there? No. Mom. The clerk glanced at the clipping again, then at the file. Well, she said, then let me be exact. She explained the road first. The property sat beyond the bus line, past the last regular cluster of houses, off a slough road that flooded badly if the tide and rain agreed with each other. A person on foot would need to watch the shoulders because trucks hauling feed and crab pots did not slow kindly around bends. There was a county gravel spur, but it had not been maintained except to allow inspection vehicles through. The smokehouse itself had been tied to an abandoned curing operation, closed decades earlier after a chain of owners died, defaulted, or simply stopped answering mail.
The last inspection says partial roof failure,
Marjorie continued. Possible mold. Possible rot. Possible animal occupancy. Possible compromised foundation. She had a way of saying possible that made it sound like already. The young woman held her hands together beneath the desk, pressing thumb to thumb until the skin paled. Could I see it before signing? You could, Marjorie said. But the deadline is 4 o'clock today. After that, the demolition contractor can proceed with scheduling. The county would be relieved to remove it. Outside the office window, rain marked the glass in fine diagonal threads. A pickup passed slowly, its tires hissing along the street. Somewhere in the building, a child began crying and stopped all at once. How much would the transfer cost besides the consideration? Marjorie's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Recording is waived under nuisance disposal. The county is trying to clear liability. The consideration is all that is required today. The number had already been counted so many times that the shape of it seemed printed on the inside of her hand. Still, she took the coins and folded bills from her coat pocket and placed them on the desk, not pushing them forward yet. She kept the extra cents hidden in her palm like a private mercy. Marjorie looked at the money, then at her. You know you cannot live there legally unless it passes inspection. Yes. Mom. You know the county may still require repairs on a timeline. Yes. Mom. You know this may not help you. The answer did not come at once. That was the one warning that reached beneath the practical fear and found the bare place where hope had been sitting too near the cold. She looked down at the paper. The smokehouse in the photograph was hardly a building anymore. It looked as if weather had leaned one elbow on it and kept leaning for years. Yet there was a door. There were walls. There was work a human hand could try to do, which was different from nothing. It might not, she said. But I understand. Marjorie drew the papers closer and turned them one at a time. There were signatures to witness, initials beside clauses, a printed acknowledgment that the buyer accepted present and future risk, and a narrow line where her name had to be written exactly as it appeared on her identification. The pen was heavy and cold at first. She wrote slowly because legal documents had already harmed her once, and her hand now refused to hurry over any line. The letters came out plain and careful. When she finished, Marjorie examined the page. The clerk reached for a brass stamp mounted on a black handle. It was older than the plastic pens, older than the computer monitor, older perhaps than everyone in the waiting area. She pressed the document beneath it, aligned the corner, and brought the stamp down with a dull, final sound. Not loud. Final. The sound moved through the desk and into the young woman's wrists. Marjorie signed as witness, separated the copies, and slid one set into a blue folder. She kept the bills on the desk for a moment, then opened a drawer and placed the money inside a shallow tray used for recording fees. There, among paper clips, a rubber finger cone, and a roll of receipt tape, the price of the unwanted building disappeared into government order. "Do you have transportation?" "No." "Mom." Marjorie removed her glasses and set them on the file. The room seemed to hold its breath in the way official rooms sometimes do when a human need has entered but has not been invited to sit. "It is 8.5 miles by the road route," she said. "Longer if you miss the spur. You will leave town east along Marine Drive. Continue toward Tongue Point. Then follow the county road past the feed warehouse and the old cannery spur. When you see the mailbox bank with 3 rusted boxes and 1 painted blue, you turn right. There is no sign for the smokehouse anymore. Not from the road. A walnut row marks the lane." She took a county map from a drawer, circled the turn with a red pencil, and wrote 2 lines of directions in a hand much less severe than her office voice. "You should not try it after dark." The young woman folded the map once, then twice. "Thank you." Marjorie's fingers rested on the top of the folder. She did not let go. "What did you say your last name was?" The question came softly enough that it might have been an afterthought, but the clerk was no longer looking at the papers. She was looking at the face across from her, at the cheekbones, perhaps, or the set of the mouth, or one of those small inheritances no one can spend and no one can hide. Marjorie repeated it once, not loudly. "I knew a woman connected to that name," she said. "Years ago. Older than me, but not by as much as she seemed. She used to come in every January to pay taxes on a shed that was not even hers by deed anymore. Said paper forgot what hands remembered." The chair beneath the young woman seemed to harden. She was family. Marjorie nodded slowly, as if some old drawer had opened inside her. "She mended nets for my husband when his hands got too arthritic. Would not take proper pay. He brought her peaches every summer instead." She slid the folder across the desk then, but kept one finger on it. She asked about that Blind Slough place once. Must have been 20 years back. Wanted to know whether a curing shed could be reclaimed if nobody claimed it. The rain made its steady markings on the glass. "What did you tell her?" "That deeds are patient," Marjorie said. "People less so." The young woman looked toward the blue folder. She did not trust herself to speak. Marjorie reached into the drawer again and pulled out a small manila envelope. From it she removed an old copy of a tax map, folded along seams gone soft with handling. She laid it beside the fresh county map. On the older one, the smokehouse parcel was marked in pencil with a small X beside the marsh edge. "This is not part of the record copy," the clerk said. "It is only a photocopy from an old file. But it may help you see where the lane ends before the ditch." "Why are you giving it?" Marjorie's face did not soften exactly. It settled. "Because some properties are trash to the county and unfinished business to somebody else." She put both maps in the folder and closed it. At the outer door, the warmth of the office left her all at once. The air tasted of rain, engine oil, and river. She tucked the blue folder inside her coat before stepping onto the sidewalk. For the first time in weeks, she was carrying more than what had been taken from her. The walk out of town began with ordinary sidewalks. She passed the marine supply store again and stopped at the window longer than she meant to. Inside were coils of line, brass cleats, rubber boots, tide charts, lantern batteries, knives, hooks, and a red-handled handsaw with a paper tag hanging from it. Tools had always made her ache a little, not because she loved objects for their own sake, but because a good tool represented trust between the hand and the work ahead. She had almost no money now, and the saw might as well have belonged to a museum case. A man swept the threshold of the bakery. The smell of yeast and cinnamon moved into the street, warm enough to feel like touch. She did not stop. Her stomach had passed beyond complaint and entered a hollow attentiveness. At the pharmacy corner, she filled her water bottle from the restroom sink and wrapped one of Ruth's old napkins around the bottle so it would not chill her hand. Marine Drive carried her east beneath a low sky. The river kept appearing between buildings, broad and pewter-colored, with barges moving slowly as if dragged by thought. Trucks passed close enough to stir her coat. Once, a driver tapped the horn, not in greeting but warning, and she stepped onto the gravel shoulder until he had gone. Her shoes were not made for distance. By the second mile, the back of one heel had opened. By the third, the tote strap had begun to cut into the muscle between neck and shoulder. Past Hung Point, the town thinned. Warehouses gave way to chain-link fences, then to wet lots where machinery sat under blue tarps. She passed a closed bait shop, a welding shed with sparks showing white through an open door, a feed warehouse smelling of grain and dust, a tavern with no cars outside yet, and a small espresso stand painted green, its window shut against the weather. Beyond that, the road narrowed, bending among alder, blackberry canes, and ditches silvered with standing water. The rain stopped for 20 minutes. That almost made the cold worse. Without the sound of rain, she could hear her own breathing and the separate notes of the landscape, red-winged blackbirds in the reeds, tires on distant wet pavement, a dog barking somewhere beyond a row of houses, the slap of loose water under a culvert. Her body wanted to sit down. Her mind kept hold of Marjorie's directions, repeating them without decoration. Mailbox bank. 3 rusted. 1 blue. Turn right. Around noon, she found the first walnut trees. They stood on either side of a gravel lane, tall, bare, and black-limbed against the colorless sky. Their leaves had already fallen and lay in damp mats along the ditch. At the road, 4 mailboxes leaned together on a post. 3 were rusted to the color of dried blood. One had been painted blue long ago and was now fading at the edges. She stood there a moment with her hand on the post. A yellow dog watched her from a neighboring yard, head low, tail not wagging. Behind it sat a narrow white house with smoke lifting from a stovepipe and laundry hanging stiff under a porch roof. An older man in a brown cap came out carrying firewood. He saw her. She saw him. Neither called out. The county gravel spur turned from the road and ran between the walnut trees toward the slough. It was not a lane so much as the memory of one. Grass grew through the middle. On either side, blackberry vines had reached inward and hooked at the air. Puddles reflected the pale sky in broken pieces. After 50 yards, the track dipped, and she had to walk along the raised center to keep her shoes from sinking. Cedar needles lay in dark patches where the wind had dragged them. The smell changed first. Town had smelled of exhaust, bakery heat, wet wool, and tide. The lane smelled of leaf mold, brackish water, cedar bark, and something old with salt still inside it. It was faint, almost hidden by damp wood and marsh grass, but she knew it before she could name it. Brine, smoke long settled, fish oil gone deep into boards and not entirely surrendered. Then she saw the sign. It hung from one chain above a low gabled doorway. The other chain broken so the sign angled downward like a head bent in sleep. Most of the paint was gone. Enough remained to show a salmon shape and 2 letters. Not words, just their ghost, S.O. The smokehouse stood beyond a crescent of beaten earth at the end of the spur. It was larger than the photograph had made it seem, though not large in any proud sense. About 30 feet long and 18 feet wide, built of cedar planks gone gray and ridged, with an oak-framed central door and 2 narrow windows on the south wall. The roof had been shingled in cedar once, but a long section near the ridge had collapsed inward, leaving a black opening where rain had entered season after season. Moss grew along the north slope. A brick chimney rose from the rear third, tilted but still standing, its cap missing. A lean-to had been added sometime later on the east side, perhaps for wood storage, perhaps for nets. Half of it had fallen. The posts remained, angled and stubborn, with blackberry canes looped through them. On the west side, the ground sloped toward Blind Slough, where reeds moved in the wind and water lay dull between mud banks. The Columbia was not visible from the door, but its presence filled the air, a broad unseen pressure beyond the marsh. The front step was a single cedar beam, split at one end. A county condemnation notice had been nailed to the door beneath a sheet of cloudy plastic. Red letters showed through. Unsafe structure. She read the words as if they had been written about a person. The door had swollen in its frame. At first, it would not move. She set down the tote, put both hands on the iron latch, and pulled. The latch gave with a flake of rust against her palm, but the door held. She braced one foot on the beam, pulled again, and felt something inside shift by the width of a breath. On the third pull, the bottom scraped hard against the floor and opened far enough for her to slip through sideways. The first breath inside nearly drove her back out. Salt, cedar, mold, cold ash, old fish oil buried in wood, mouse droppings, damp rope. The smell was heavy and layered, not rotten exactly, but aged beyond welcome. It entered the throat and stayed there. She covered her mouth with one sleeve until her eyes stopped watering. Light came through the broken roof and the 2 narrow windows, falling in pale bars across the front room. The floorboards were cedar, cupped with moisture but not entirely gone. Near the doorway, leaves had blown in and gathered against the wall. A rusted scale hung from a hook beside a workbench. On the bench lay a broken glass jar, 3 bent nails, a length of twine, and a knife handle with no blade. Along the north wall, wooden racks rose in tiers where fish would once have hung. Some rods remained in place. Others had fallen and lay like bones underfoot. She did not step quickly. Ingrid's lessons, though the woman herself was gone, remained in the body. Test before trusting. Weight over the joist. Listen. She placed one foot, waited, then the other. The floor answered with creaks of different kinds. One dry and sharp. One low and damp. One deep note near the center that told her not to stand there too long. The front room had been for preparation. That much was clear. There was a long table under the south windows, its top split but still level enough to have held fish. Beneath it were shallow drawers, most hanging open, empty except for dust and the papery remains of mouse nests. Pegs on the wall had once held tools. Each peg carried a clean outline in the grime where something useful had been removed. A coil of net twine sat in a corner, fused by damp into a single dark lump. In the back room, the ceiling lowered and the air grew stronger. This was the smoking chamber. The brick firebox occupied the far wall, black-mouthed and choked with fallen mortar. Above it, Iron bars crossed between cedar supports, and from those bars hung a few remaining hooks, dark with age. The floor here was not cedar but brick laid over packed earth, though moss had found the seams. A small vent near the roofline hung open, its flap broken. Wind moved through it with a thin, almost human whistle. Against the west wall stood 3 oak-curing vats. They were enormous things, each the size of a narrow bed, bound with iron hoops gone red from rust. 2 were empty except for leaves and collapsed staves. The third still had its lid, a round cedar disc fitted over the top and weighted by a stone. Salt had crusted along the rim in pale ridges. It looked less like residue than winter itself had entered and hardened there. She stood before it longer than she meant to. There was work everywhere. Roof first, or perhaps a tarp before roof. Door bottom planed or lifted. Firebox inspected before any flame. Windows covered. Floor mapped. Water found. Food found. A place to sleep found. Each need waited in line, patient and severe. But for a few minutes she only listened. The building made sounds around her. Drips from the broken roof. A board settling. Wind along the vent. Reeds outside bending against one another. Farther off. A truck on the road. Then nothing. Not silence exactly. A settled hush, holding the shape of all that had been done there and all that had stopped. She returned to the front room before the light failed. From her tote she removed the flattened cardboard, the quilt Ruth had given her, 2 shirts, the water bottle, the pocket knife, and the photograph. She chose a place against the east wall where the roof still held, and the floor did not complain under her weight. With the knife, she scraped mouse droppings into a pile and brushed them away using a broken cedar strip. Then she laid down the cardboard, folded the quilt double, and set her tote at the end like a poor sort of pillow. She did not eat because there was nothing left that could be called supper. She drank water slowly. Hunger moved through her in waves, then thinned into the background. Cold gathered early. By dusk, the front room had lost what little warmth the day had given it. She put on both shirts beneath her coat and wrapped the quilt around her legs. Before dark, she went outside once more. The slough lay behind the smokehouse, half hidden by reeds and alder. At low tide, mud showed in broad slick shelves. The air smelled of salt grass and far water. A great blue heron stood near the opposite bank, still as a carved thing, one leg lifted, eye fixed on whatever moved beneath the surface. She watched it until it struck and swallowed, then folded itself back into patience. The White House beyond the walnut row had a light in the kitchen window. Smoke rose straight from its stovepipe, then bent east. The yellow dog barked twice and stopped. No one came down the lane. When she returned inside, the smokehouse had darkened to shapes. The racks were shadows. The workbench was a shadow. The curing vats in back were deeper shadows beyond the doorway. She found her sleeping place by memory and lowered herself onto the cardboard, careful with her sore heel. The quilt smelled faintly of basement potatoes from the church, and beneath that, wool, dust, and human kindness. She placed the blue folder beneath her head, not because it was soft, but because paper could be stolen, ruined, or doubted unless kept close. Her hand rested over it for a while. She listened to the roof drip into a metal pan she had found and moved under the open seam. The drops came unevenly. 1, then 3, then a pause long enough for sleep to approach, then 1 more. In the night, the cold became exact. It entered through the broken roof, through the door gap, through the floorboards, through the sleeves where her wrists showed. She curled around herself and tucked her hands beneath her arms. Once, something small moved inside the wall and stopped when she lifted her head. Once, wind pushed the door inward by half an inch and the hinges gave a tired cry. She did not pray in words. Words had become expensive. Instead, she counted the things that remained. A folder, a map, a photograph, a knife, a quilt, a body not yet finished, a building not yet gone. She counted them slowly, like coins placed one by one on a counter, and when she reached the end, she began again. Near midnight, rain returned. It struck the broken roof with a soft, steady insistence, then found paths through the cedar and fell into the room in separate voices. One dripped near the workbench, one against the metal pan, one into the leaves by the door, one somewhere in the back, deep and hollow, as if water were entering an old wooden vessel. She opened her eyes. The sound came again. Hollow. Not loud. Not near enough to alarm her. But distinct from the rest of the rain, a small dark note under the weather. She listened until the cold made her jaw tremble and sleep took the edges from everything. Toward morning, fog settled low around the smokehouse. The first light did not enter so much as gather. It whitened the windows, softened the racks, silvered the iron hooks, and laid a faint sheen across the salt crust on the covered vat in the back room. She woke with one hand still over the folder and the taste of cedar smoke in her mouth. The smokehouse was not empty. It had been waiting. The first morning gave her work before it gave her hope. Freya rose stiffly from the cardboard and stood a long while before moving, letting each joint report itself in the gray light. Her hip ached from the floor. Her heel had sealed badly to the inside of her sock. Cold had made her fingers slow, as if each knuckle had been wrapped in wet twine. She did not spend words on any of it. She folded the quilt, set it on the workbench away from the drips, and began learning what the place required. Water came first. Marjorie's map had marked an old well house beyond the south wall, but the word well had sounded kinder than the thing itself. It was a square plank box half swallowed by salmonberry canes, with a rusted hand pump bolted to a concrete cap. Ferns grew around the base. A slug moved along the handle with patient ownership. Freya cleared vines with the pocket knife and a cedar strip, then worked the pump until her shoulder burned. Nothing came. She waited, primed it with the little water left in her bottle, and tried again. The pump groaned from somewhere underground. Rust-colored water spat twice, then stopped. On the fourth try, a thin stream came up smelling of iron and leaves. She let it run into the weeds until it cleared enough to fill the bottle, then held it to the morning light. Small particles drifted inside. Not clean enough to trust. Clean enough to boil, if she could make fire. The outhouse stood farther back, near a stand of alder and one leaning fence post. Its door hung on leather hinges gone stiff with weather. A crescent moon had been cut into the plank, and through that opening a spider had built a web so symmetrical that Freya paused before disturbing it. She found a broom handle without bristles behind the smokehouse and used it to test the floorboards. Two held. One did not. She marked the bad board with a scratch from the pocket knife and closed the door gently. By noon, she had mapped the first room with her feet. The floor had a language. Near the entrance, the boards complained but held. In front of the workbench, they gave a dry chirp and settled. 2 steps from the doorway to the smoking chamber, there was a deep, wet flex that made her step back at once. Near the south windows, The planks were firm where light had kept them drier. She tore strips from the broken cardboard and laid them like warnings on places not to trust. She worked without tools because she had almost none. A bent nail became a hook. A broken cedar strip became a scraper. The empty glass jar, once wrapped in a cloth to protect her palm from its cracked lip, became a scoop for leaves and mouse nests. She swept with fir boughs tied together with twine pulled from the wall. And when the twine broke, she knotted it again the way Ingrid had shown her, following the original pattern instead of closing the hole in panic. The second day, fog pressed so thick against the windows that the world beyond the glass became only pale motion. She boiled water in a rusted coffee tin over a candle stub she found in a drawer, using shavings from a dry cedar splinter to coax the flame. It took nearly 40 minutes and left soot on the tin. The water tasted of metal. She drank it anyway, slowly enough to make it count. Food became the question she avoided until it would no longer wait. In her tote were 17 cents, a heel of bread too hard to chew without soaking, and the 2 boiled eggs from Ruth now only memory. She softened the bread in hot water, sprinkled it with a few grains of salt scraped from the rim of the covered vat, then stopped with the salt on her fingertips. It was not hers to eat without knowing what it had touched. She brushed it away and swallowed the plain wet bread instead. On the third day, the rain let up long enough for her to walk the lane and follow the road back toward the houses. She did not intend to ask anyone for charity. Pride was not the reason. Pride had become too heavy to carry, and she had put it down somewhere between Seaside and Longview. But asking for food in a place where she now held a deed felt dangerous. People could look at hunger and decide a woman was not fit to own even a ruin. So she walked past the White House and the yellow dog, nodding once to the older man in the brown cap when he looked up from splitting kindling. He nodded back, not warmly, but not as if she were smoke. The road brought her, after nearly an hour, to a small commercial strip she had missed on the way in because exhaustion had narrowed her vision. There was a feed store with sacks stacked in the window, a closed barber shop with a striped pole that no longer turned, a post office hardly larger than a fishing cabin, a diner called Doris's with lace curtains and 3 trucks outside, and, at the far end, a hardware store under a corrugated metal awning. The sign read Bellwether Hardware and Supply. The bell above the door rang with an old-fashioned honesty when she entered. Warmth came first, then smells, sawdust, seed packets, kerosene, oiled metal, rope, coffee on a hot plate, and the mineral scent of concrete floors. Every wall held useful things. Nails had an open bin sorted by size. Mason jars held washers, cotter pins, brass screws, and hinges. Coils of cotton sash cord hung from hooks. There were axes, hand saws, stovepipe sections, galvanized buckets, paintbrushes, rolls of roofing felt, clamps, putty knives, and one whole shelf of books with curled covers teaching ordinary people how to mend what money could not replace. A man stood behind the counter repairing a lantern. He was tall but bent through the upper back, with a white beard clipped square under his chin and eyebrows so long they seemed to shade his eyes. A scar crossed the back of his left hand, pale and roped, disappearing beneath the cuff of a flannel shirt mended twice at the elbow. His name, stitched on a faded patch above his shirt pocket, was Amos, though the store sign behind him made the fuller name plain. Amos Bellwether, Ochre. He looked up from the lantern. "You are from the Slough place." It was not a question. Freya stopped just inside the door, one hand still on the latch. "Yes, sir. Thought so." Not many people walk in from that direction with cedar dust on their coat. She looked down. Fine gray powder clung to both sleeves. I need to know what a tarp cost. Holmes set the lantern globe aside. His movements were slow but exact, a man measuring the life left in every joint. What size hole? She described it as best she could, using her hands to show the broken run along the roof ridge, the sag, the place where rain came in above the workbench. Amos listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Temporary cover, he said. Not a fix. 16 by 20 tarp, if you overlap right. Better would be 20 by 30, but that costs more and catches wind like a sail. How much? He turned to the shelf behind him. 16 by 20. Medium duty, $9.89. Roofing nails, 1 pound, $2.40. Last strips if you need battens, 15 cents each. You need rope more than you need faith if the wind comes west. She held still. Prices had become another form of weather. I cannot buy those today. I figured there was no pity in it, only arithmetic. He put the legal pad on the counter between them. On it he wrote numbers in a blocky hand. Wire brush, 160. Work gloves, canvas, $2.25. Masonry chisel, $3 1 pound 8D common nails, $2.40. Blue tarp, 16 by 20, $9.89. Cotton rope, 3 8-inch 19s per foot. Stove brush rental, $2 per day. Dust mask of 35 cents. Putty knife, 75. Kerosene lantern, used, $4.50. Lamp oil, pint. The list looked less like supplies than a mountain drawn in ink. I can work, she said. Amos leaned back slightly. At what? Cleaning. Inventory. Stacking. Labeling. I know fish work. I know rope. I can learn the rest. He watched her long enough that she became aware of the worn places in her cuffs and the fact that her hair had come loose near one ear. He was not assessing her as a man might. He was assessing whether the answer in front of him would hold weight. You ever keep? Yes. Ever pay one? When I could. That is the only honest answer. He turned, took a ledger from a shelf, and opened it near the back. I will start you a credit account for $20. Not cash. Supplies only. You sign what you take. You pay when you can. If you cannot pay, you tell me before I have to ask. She stared at the ledger. I do not have references. You have that smokehouse, he said. A person does not take on a building like that unless she is desperate or stubborn. Both can be useful if pointed right. From the shelf of curled books, he pulled a volume with a cracked orange cover and set it beside the ledger. Practical Repairs for Farm and Outbuilding Owners. The title had faded along the spine. Someone had written 1963 inside the cover in blue ink. The pages smelled of dust, glue, and mouse-chewed corners. This is not for sale, Amos said. It is a loan. Chapter 2 for roofs. Chapter 4 for chimneys. Chapter 7 for floors. Do not skip the warnings because they are printed smaller. She touched the cover with 2 fingers. Thank you. Do not thank me until the roof holds. He turned the ledger toward her. Name. She wrote it carefully. He glanced at the name but did not comment. Instead, he lifted a wire brush, a used bucket, a dust mask, canvas gloves, 1 stub of carpenter's pencil, a length of rope, and 3 lath strips onto the counter. Then, after a pause, he added an old putty knife with paint dried along the handle. That one does not go on the account, he said. It is too ugly to charge for. The walk back was slower because the bucket knocked against her knee and the manual was tucked under her coat to keep it dry. At Doris's diner, a woman in a white apron stood in the doorway shaking a rag. She watched Freya pass with the hardware store bucket and said nothing. 10 steps later, the door opened again. "You eat today?" Freya turned. The woman had heavy arms, gray hair twisted under a net, and a face made stern by habit rather than dislike. "Yes." Mom Freya lied. The woman looked at her. "Do not lie outside a diner. It makes the building feel foolish." She disappeared inside and returned with a paper bag rolled tight at the top. Freya accepted it because refusal would have been a performance neither of them needed. She did not open it until she was back among the walnut trees. Inside were 2 biscuits, a hard-boiled egg, and an apple bruised on one side. The smokehouse received her with the same smell, the same drips, the same stern list of needs. Yet the bucket, brush, gloves, and manual changed the room. They were not enough to save anything. They were enough to begin. She started with the chimney because fire had become the center of every practical thought. The manual warned in plain language that a blocked flue could kill a person without waking her. It described creosote as black, brittle, tar-like residue, formed when smoke cooled too quickly and unburned compounds condensed along the chimney walls. It said not to assume any old chimney was safe because smoke had once passed through it. It said inspect from below, inspect from above, then clean until the brush moved freely and falling debris stopped. The roof was too dangerous to climb, so she began from below. The brick firebox had a rusted cleanout door at the base, sealed by ash and corrosion. She worked the putty knife along the edge. Then the masonry chisel she could not yet afford but had borrowed from Amos under a separate note in the ledger. After 20 minutes, the door opened with a dry crack. Soot fell onto her boots. She tied the wire brush to the end of a cedar pole found behind the racks, then extended it with another pole lashed tight using clove hitches that held better than the wood deserved. It was not the proper stove brush. She knew that. Amos had warned her. But the rental cost mattered, and the flue opening was narrow enough that the wire head could do the first rough work if she moved carefully. She spread old newspaper from a drawer beneath the opening, tied the dust mask behind her head, and pushed the brush upward. The first fall of creosote came down like black hail. It struck the newspaper, her sleeves, her hair, the bricks around the firebox. The smell was bitter and sharp, a cold version of smoke without comfort. She coughed behind the mask and stepped back until the air cleared. Then she went again. Up, twist, pull. Up, twist, pull. When the pole stuck, she did not force it. She backed down, changed angle, and tried again. By the second hour, her shoulders trembled. By the third, her hands had blistered inside the canvas gloves. By the fourth, she had filled half the bucket with soot, broken flakes of creosote, bird nesting material, and 2 small bones she did not examine closely. At one point, a whole shelf of hardened tar came loose above her and slid down the flue with a sound like plates breaking in another room. She worked until daylight thinned. Then she took the bucket outside, carried it beyond the outhouse, and buried the debris in a shallow pit under wet leaves because she did not yet know what else was safe. When she returned, she shone the last daylight up through the flue, using a piece of mirror found in the drawer. No clean circle of sky appeared, only a dull grayness. The chimney was not clear enough. The next day, she went back to Amos and rented the proper stove brush. It cost $2, and he did not pretend otherwise. The brush had a round wire head stiff enough to scrape brick properly, with 4 rods that screwed together one after another. Amos showed her how to turn clockwise so the rods would not unscrew inside the flue. He demonstrated on the counter using 2 fingers and a pencil. "Clockwise going up," he said. "Clockwise coming down. You forget that. You buy the rods." "Yes, sir." "You wear the "Yes, sir." "You stop if mortar falls in chunks bigger than your thumb." "Yes, sir." He looked at her coat, at the soot already embedded near the cuffs. "And you wash before eating, even if all you are eating is nothing." She almost smiled but did not quite remember how. "With the proper brush," the chimney answered more honestly. The rod scraped upward foot by foot. Creosote fell in flakes, then powder, then fine dust. Twice she stopped because mortar grains came down with the soot, but no large chunks followed. She cleaned from the firebox, then opened the exterior cleanout she found behind blackberry canes at the rear of the chimney and worked from there, crouched in mud while rain needled the back of her neck. 8 hours passed between morning and dark, not all at once but in pieces broken by shaking hands. Boiled water and half a biscuit saved from the diner bag. At last, when she angled the mirror again, a faint square of gray light showed high above. The first fire was not made for warmth. It was made as a test, which meant it had to be small, dry, and watched without trust. She gathered pencil-thin cedar splinters from fallen racks, shaved curls from a dry strip with the pocket knife, and set 3 pieces of kindling in a loose triangle on the firebox grate. The manual said never to use damp wood for a chimney test if one could help it. Damp wood made smoke, and smoke lied about draft. She lit the shavings with the candle stub. The flame took, bent, hesitated, and leaned toward the chimney. Freya crouched before it, one hand on the brick, feeling for heat where there should not yet be heat, listening for crackle, watching the smoke. A little entered the room at first, blue and uncertain. She adjusted the broken vent, opened the front door by 2 inches, and the flame steadied. The smoke pulled upward into the flue. Clean. Not strong yet. Not enough for any grand comfort. But clean enough for a tin of water, clean enough for warmed bread, clean enough to tell the room that heat had returned by lawful means. She made her first hot meal from what she had been given and what could be spared. Half an apple sliced thin. The last hard edge of bread softened in boiling water. A pinch of salt from a paper packet Amos had placed inside the manual without saying so. She ate from the coffee tin with the putty knife handle because she had no spoon. It was not good in the way a meal becomes good through flavor. It was good because it was warm and stayed down. After the chimney, the workroom became the next territory. She began inventorying because disorder wastes energy, and she had none to spare. On the 3rd sheet torn from the back of the manual, she made columns with the carpenter's pencil. Usable. Repairable. Firewood. Unknown. The workbench was 12 feet long, cedar top over oak legs, split near the right corner, but still bearing weight. Usable, after cleaning. The drawer pulls were iron rings, 2 missing, 1 intact. Repairable. 3 glass floats from old nets sat beneath the bench. 1 cracked, 2 whole, cloudy green with bubbles trapped inside. Unknown, but kept. A broken scale hung on the wall, brass face stained brown. Needle frozen at 11 pounds. Repairable, perhaps. 7 iron smoking hooks lay under the rack, 3 straight, 4 bent. Usable after scrubbing. 1 whetstone, hollowed in the center from years of blades, sat behind a jar of mouse-chewed paper labels. Kept without category. In the front drawer she found paper packets of rusted staples, a spool of linen thread, a wooden-handled awl with the tip still sharp, and an empty tobacco tin containing fish scales so old they had turned translucent as mica. In the second drawer, nothing but acorn shells and a red pencil worn to a nub. In the third, a coil of copper wire, 3 corks, and a child's marble, blue glass with a white twist at the center. She placed each item in rows on the cleaned half of the workbench. In the smoking chamber, she counted the racks. 12 vertical supports. 9 sound enough to keep, 3 split near the base. 21 hanging rods, 16 still seated in their notches, 5 on the floor. Iron hooks, after further searching, 32. 1 ash shovel behind the firebox, handle burned at the end but usable. 1 poker, bent. 1 small cast iron trivet, legs uneven. 2 bricks loose from the firebox lip. Mortar loss along the left cheek. Vent flap broken at hinge. The curing vats waited until afternoon. They were the kind of objects that seemed to gather silence around themselves. Oak staves, iron hoops, rims furred with old salt. 2 were ruined beyond immediate use. The first had lost 3 staves, leaving a gap wide enough for a raccoon. The second had warped so badly that the bottom showed daylight. The third, the covered one, stood under the west wall where the roof had leaked less, though the air above it held a mineral cold. The cedar disc on top had been cut in a perfect circle, fitted within the rim instead of laid across it. A round stone sat in the center, smooth and dark, perhaps taken from the river. Salt crystals had grown along the seam between disc and vat, layer over layer, until the edge looked sealed with pale rock. She did not open it that day. Instead, she tested. First, the sound. She tapped the side of the first ruined vat with the putty knife handle. The note was dull and open. She tapped the second. Hollow, uneven, cracked. She tapped the third near the rim. The sound came back dense, as expected, packed with something heavy. Then she tapped lower, near the bottom. The note changed. It was still heavy, but not in the way packed salt should be heavy. There was a brief wooden echo beneath it, a kept space answering through layers. She tapped again, once near the left stave, once near the right, once at the center. The center returned a darker sound. She marked the place with pencil. Next, the weight. She tried to shift the stone from the cedar disc and could barely move it. With both hands, she rolled it toward the rim. It thudded against the edge and stayed there. The cedar disc beneath should have lifted once the weight was gone. It did not. Salt had sealed it tight. She worked the putty knife along the seam. The first layer broke in small grains. Beneath it lay more salt, harder, translucent in places, gray-white where damp had carried smoke into it. She scraped for 20 minutes and gained perhaps 3 inches. Her wrist cramped. She rested. Then she fetched warm water, dipped a cloth, and pressed it along the seam to soften the crust. The smell rose slowly. Not rot. Not spoilage. Salt and oak. Old brine. Something faintly sweet beneath the mineral edge. She scraped again. The putty knife slipped and cut the side of her thumb. She wrapped it in a strip torn from her shirt hem and continued more carefully. By evening, half the seam was clear. The disc still held. She slept that night with the knowledge of it under the floor of her mind. Each time she woke, the covered vat seemed to stand more fully in the dark. Rain had stopped. The room was cold enough to show her breath when she turned toward the doorway. Somewhere beyond the slough, an owl called once, and the sound folded itself into the rafters. In the morning, she went to Amos. "I need to open something without breaking it," she said. He looked up from sorting screws. "That is most of repair." She described the cedar disc and the salt crust. Amos listened, then handed her a narrow pry bar no longer than her forearm, a wooden mallet, and a stiff paint scraper. No iron edge against good oak if you can avoid it. Work around. Do not pry one side hard. You will split the disc. Tap. Lift. Move. Tap. Lift. Move. How much? On the account. It is already too much. It is $14.12. 20 was the ceiling I gave you, not the distance to heaven. He wrote the items down, then crossed out the pry bar. Borrowed. Bring it back straight. At the diner, Doris saw the tools and handed her coffee in a paper cup before she could object. "It is from yesterday," Doris said. "Do not flatter it." The coffee was lukewarm and bitter. Freya carried it like a lantern. Back at the smokehouse, she cleared the room before beginning. She moved the inventory rows away from the vat, laid the quilt folded on the floor to catch anything that might fall, and opened the front door for light. The yellow dog had followed her halfway down the lane but stayed outside, sitting at the threshold with its ears lifted. Tap. Lift. Move. She worked the scraper into the seam, tapped the handle with the mallet, then slid the pry bar only where the cedar gave permission. Salt cracked in bright lines. The disc rose by the width of a fingernail, then settled. She moved 6 inches and tried again. The room filled with the dry clicking of old crystals breaking. An hour passed. The disc loosened on the east side first. When it lifted, a seam of air escaped, carrying a deep briny smell so concentrated that she stepped back. It was the smell of a working room closed in the middle of a sentence. Salt, cedar, oak, smoke, and time pressed together until they became one thing. She waited for any sourness. None came. Another hour. The west side resisted. She wetted the cloth again, pressed it along the seam, and rested her forehead briefly against the rim of the vat, not from tenderness but because her back had begun to tremble. Then she heard Ingrid's voice in memory, not as a vision, not as comfort, only as instruction. Slowly, she adjusted the pry bar by half an inch. The disc released with a sound like a held breath leaving an old chest. Freya caught one edge before it dropped, then lifted it aside with both hands and leaned it against the wall. Inside the vat, salt filled nearly 3/4 of the depth. Not loose salt, not ordinary granules. It had hardened into a single pale mass, uneven on top, crystal ridges rising like frozen waves. The upper layer was gray with dust. Beneath the scratches from her scraper, it shone faintly amber. She pressed the putty knife into it. The surface resisted like soft stone. No fish remained. No barrel of forgotten rot. Only salt, old and cured by its own keeping. She chipped at one corner and small translucent flakes came loose, square-edged, smelling faintly of kelp, cedar smoke, and mineral earth. She placed them in a jar, not because she yet understood their value, but because they seemed too deliberate to sweep away. Then she remembered the sound near the bottom. The hard salt would have to come out. There was no elegant way to do it. She used the chisel, the mallet, and later the ash shovel, working in sections no larger than her hand. The mass broke along hidden planes. Some pieces were milky white, some smoke gray, some tinted rose at the center. She carried them to the workbench, sorted clean from dirty, covered what looked pure with cloth, and set aside the rest for later judgment. By the third hour, her arms had become separate creatures, stubborn and dull. By the fifth, the floor around the vat glittered with salt dust. Light shifted across the room. The dog outside had gone. A crow landed on the broken leander roof and complained once, then flew away. Near the bottom, the chisel struck something that did not sound like salt or oak. A flat note. She froze. She cleared the area with her hands, brushing crystals aside. There, beneath the last compacted layer, was a cedar plug, round and smooth, about 10 inches across, fitted into the bottom boards of the vat. It had been covered so completely that no seam had shown. A shallow notch had been carved at one edge, just enough for a tool if the finder knew to look. Freya sat back on her heels. The plug was not a repair. It was too deliberate, too exact. She cleaned around it with the awl, grain by grain, then used the putty knife to scrape the seam clear. The plug had swollen over the years. It did not want to turn. She fitted the pry bar into the notch, changed her mind, and reached instead for the wooden mallet. Tap the edge. Turn by pressure. Tap again. The cedar gave a faint complaint. She worked around the circle 3 times before it shifted. Under the plug was darkness. Not deep. A compartment between the vat bottom and a false base, lined with tarred cloth. The smell changed again, from salt to something drier, sealed away from air. Her hand hovered above the opening. She did not reach in at once. Some thresholds deserve the respect of a pause. Then she reached. The first thing she lifted was wrapped in oilcloth tied with cotton cord. She set it on the quilt. A second package followed, longer and narrower. A third, square and heavy. Beneath those was a small tin box sealed with wax around the lid. And under the tin, wedged tightly into the compartment, was a dark green waterproof case with brass latches, the kind fishermen once used for papers that could not be allowed to drown. Freya removed everything and laid the cedar plug beside the opening. Her hands had begun to shake, so she washed them before unwrapping anything. The water in the coffee tin had gone cold. She used it anyway, rubbing salt from her fingers, drying them on the inside of her coat where the cloth was cleanest. Then she knelt on the quilt. The first oilcloth package held tools. Not many. Only those someone had loved enough to hide properly. A boning knife with a dark wooden handle worn smooth by use, its blade oiled and wrapped in waxed paper. A copper thermometer with an ivory face, the glass cracked at one corner but the needle resting true. 2 netting needles carved from bone or antler, polished from years of fingers. A small brass salometer for measuring brine strength, its scale marked in careful tiny numbers. A cedar handled awl finer than the one from the drawer. Freya did not touch the thermometer at first. She knew it before she allowed herself to know it. Not by proof. By the crack. By the ivory face. By the way memory recognizes the weight of what was promised and lost. When she finally lifted it, the metal lay cold across her palm. The second package held raw material. Bundles of linen twine, dry and usable because of the oilcloth. 3 folded cotton nets. Not large, perhaps for demonstration or repair. A packet of cedar splints thin as ribbon, wrapped with a note that said Upper Ridge Cedar. No pitch. 4 small cloth bags tied with red thread, each labeled in an older hand juniper, bay, spruce tips, alder ash. A glass vial of something dark and resinous sealed with cork and wax. The square package held salt. Not the rough pieces she had chipped from the vat, but a carefully kept batch wrapped first in parchment, then cloth, then oilskin. The crystals were coarse, irregular, and faintly rose-gray, with darker flecks like ground smoke caught inside. A label had been tucked beneath the cord. Grandmother Signy's winter salt. Do not waste on haste. Freya read the words 3 times. The tin box came next. Wax cracked under the pocket knife. The lid resisted, then opened with a soft scrape. Inside were coins wrapped in paper rolls gone brittle, a small dark ribbon, a medal, and 3 folded notes tied together with thread. She did not open the notes. She had seen the first line of writing on the top fold and was not ready for a voice to enter. The medal lay on a strip of faded blue ribbon. It was bronze, darkened at the high places, marked with a profile and the year 1918 on the reverse. Not a decoration she understood fully, but military, unmistakably, carried home from some terrible geography and hidden beneath salt instead of placed in a drawer where grief might have to look at it daily. She set it down with both hands. The coin rolls were heavier than they looked. She opened one and found silver $50, walking Liberty figures worn smooth at the knees and shoulders. Another held mercury dimes, their winged caps bright where paper had protected them. A third held buffalo nickels, dates faint but visible on some. There were wheat pennies in a tobacco pouch, a few silver quarters, and 1 gold coin wrapped separately in a square of cloth, an Indian head half-eagle dated 1909. She did not yet count them. The waterproof case remained. Its brass latches had greened at the edges but held. She scraped wax from one hinge, pressed the first latch, then the second. Both opened. Inside, wrapped in a rubberized sleeve, were bank envelopes, stacked flat and banded with cloth tape. The top envelope bore a bank name from Astoria in lettering that belonged to another century. Beneath it were newer envelopes, added over time perhaps, each marked only with a year. She carried the case to the workbench because counting on the floor felt wrong. The light had begun to lower, and she did not want lamplight or fire near old paper until she understood what lay before her. She opened the front door wider, set the envelopes in a row, and took the carpenter's pencil from her pocket. On a clean page torn from the manual's back matter, she wrote columns. Bills, coins, metal, notes, salt, tools. Then she began. The bills were not all of one time. Some were older large-size notes kept flat in sleeves, too strange for her to treat like money. Most were later currency, bundled by denomination. 10s, 20s, 50s. A few hundreds with faces she had seen all her life, but never in such number. Each bundle had been counted once by somebody careful. She counted again because disbelief requires arithmetic. She counted once. Then again. Then a third time, whispering only the numbers, not what they meant. The bills came to $47,860. The coins, after she opened the rolls and tallied them by type, added $140.73 in face value, not counting whatever a collector might say about age, mint, or rarity. Walking Liberty $50. Mercury dimes. Buffalo nickels. Wheat pennies. Washington quarters silver enough to ring differently when stacked. The single gold half-eagle she listed separately and did not assign a spendable value because some objects are not money first, no matter what the law says. Together, by face and bill, the cash came to $48,073. She wrote the number and put the pencil down. For a long while, she did not move. Outside, the marsh went on being marsh. Water shifted in the slough. Wind threaded through the walnut branches. A truck passed on the road, its sound rising and fading. The roof dripped once into the pan. Nothing in the world acknowledged that a woman with a cut thumb and soot in her hair had just counted more money than she had ever touched, hidden in a building sold away for less than a meal. Her first act was not joy. She closed the door. Then she checked the windows, the back room, the lean-to, the lane beyond the walnut trees. No one was there. The yellow dog was not even at the threshold. She returned to the workbench, stacked the bills exactly as she had found them, and placed the cloth tape around them again. Her hands moved with almost painful care. Fear came practical, not dramatic. Paper could burn. Thieves could enter. Damp could ruin what decades had preserved. Banks asked questions. Debt collectors might find records. Names attached themselves to money in ways she did not yet understand. The forged papers in her past had taught her that a signature could become a trap, and she was not eager to step into another one simply because the trap gleamed. She put the bills back into the waterproof case. She returned the coins to the tin, except the gold piece, which she wrapped again and placed with the metal. She set the tools together on the cleanest part of the bench. The winter salt she wrapped once more, then placed inside the bucket, covered with cloth, and pushed beneath the bench where roof drips could not reach. The notes remained tied. The top folded page had dark ink visible through the paper. Not the same as the labels, not Amos's hand, not Marjorie's. A woman's handwriting, perhaps, though handwriting did not belong neatly to gender. Upright. Exact. Patient. My dear one, whoever you are. That was all she allowed herself to read. The 4 words were enough to make her step backward. Whoever had hidden these things had not hidden them only from the world. They had hidden them toward someone, toward a future hand, toward a person poor enough, stubborn enough, or lost enough to open the vat rather than let the county grind the building into debris. The thought unsettled her more than the money. She tied the notes again and placed them in the tin. Then she carried the tin, the waterproof case, the metal, and the tools into the front room and sat on the floor with her back against the wall that still held. Evening entered without asking. The smokehouse darkened from the corners inward. She could have lit the firebox. She could have boiled water. She could have counted again. Instead, she sat until the visible world thinned to outlines. At last, she rose and went outside. The air was cold and wet, but after the salt chamber it felt clean. The tide had turned. Water was moving into Blind Slough in slow muscles. Lifting reeds, filling the mud channels, carrying the smell of the Pacific inward through the mouth of the river. Far off, a ship horn sounded, low and mournful, then dissolved in fog. Freya walked down to the edge of the marsh, careful where the ground softened. She stood with her arms folded inside her coat and watched the water until she could no longer tell whether it was gray, black, or silver. The heron was not there that evening. In its place, 2 ducks moved along the opposite bank, dipping their heads in the shallows with domestic seriousness. She had not read the letter. That seemed important. There are discoveries a person opens with the hands and discoveries that must wait until the soul has swept a room for them. She had opened wood, salt, oilcloth, tin, paper, and metal. She had not yet made space for a stranger's voice, especially one that had begun with such careful welcome. Behind her, the smokehouse stood with its broken roof and leaning wall, no different from the road. The county would still call it unsafe. Amos would still mark the account. Doris would still see too much from her diner doorway. Marjorie's stamp would still sit on a desk among ordinary papers. Nothing had been repaired by the finding. The work had not vanished, but the ruin had changed its weight. Freya remained by the slough until cold reached through the soles of her shoes. When she returned inside, she placed the unopened letter beside the copper thermometer, laid the metal near the folded notes, and wrapped the waterproof case in the quilt's far corner. She slept on the cardboard without undressing, one hand resting against the tin box, the other curled beneath her cheek. All night, the roof dripped in its uneven rhythm. The smokehouse was not empty. It had been waiting. Morning arrived with a pale line under the door and a single crow walking across the broken lean-to roof. Freya woke before the cold had loosened from the floor. For a moment she lay still, listening to the smokehouse as if it were a body breathing around her. Drip in the pan, wind in the roof seam, faint tick of a loose hook turning somewhere in the smoking chamber. The tin box rested by her ribs beneath the folded edge of the quilt, and the unopened letter lay on the workbench beside the copper thermometer with the cracked ivory face. She did not touch it at once. First, she made the room ready in the only ways available to her. She stirred last night's ash and found 2 black coals with no heat left in them. She set fresh cedar splinters in the firebox but did not light them. She boiled water over the smallest flame she could trust, then washed her hands carefully, paying attention to the cut on her thumb where the salt had entered and dried. She brushed grit from the workbench with a folded strip of cloth. She set the boning knife, netting needles, salometer, and metal in a careful row, not for display, but because disorder would make the letter harder to bear. Only then did she untie the thread. The paper had been folded into thirds and then folded once more across the middle, the creases softened by years but still faithful to their first shape. The ink had browned. One corner had darkened where oil from a hand, long dead, had entered the fibers. Freya opened it slowly, and as the first page flattened beneath her palms, recognition came not as certainty, but as a faint, bodily knowledge. The handwriting matched the labels on the salt and herbs. Upright, narrow, exact. Letters made by someone who did not hurry even when time was poor. Freya drew the copper thermometer nearer, placing it at the top of the page like a paperweight. Then she bent over the workbench while cold light gathered across the cedar boards and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has found your hands, then either our family has remembered the way back, or need has driven a stranger to work with more patience than pride. I welcome either one. A house cannot choose the footsteps that cross its threshold, but it can know when a hand has opened something carefully. I am writing from St. Vincent Hospital in Portland, Oregon, where Dr. Edwin Markham has told me the shadow in my lung is not a winter sickness and will not be bargained with. He said it kindly, and I believed him because he did not look away when he spoke. I am 64 years old as I write this, which is not young, though it is younger than I meant to be. I have asked for paper, and for the tin box, and for my glasses. The nurse has given me all 3. My mother was Sing Ragnhild Sorensen, born in Bergen in 1868, brought across the Atlantic as a girl. and taught by her own mother that salt was a form of memory. My father was Thomas Wyatt Joseph, born near the Lower Columbia in 1861, a net maker and river pilot, whose mother belonged to the people who knew these waters before our names were written here. They married in Astoria in 1889 and built the first curing room near Blind Slough, with cedar split by hand and oak barrels salvaged from a ship chandler. Their daughter, Elise Signé Joseph, my mother, was born in 1892 in a house that smelled of alder smoke and wet wool. She married Nils Halverson in 1912, and I was born the next winter during a storm that pushed river water over the marsh road. My full name is Marta Elise Halvorsen, though in town most people called me Maddie, and later Mrs. Halverson, as if a woman becomes smaller once her work is known. The trade came down through women because men were often taken by water, war, fever, or pride. Signé kept the first cure. Elise improved the winter salt. I learned the draft by watching the smoke bend under the eaves before I was tall enough to reach the racks. We salted Chinook for winter tables, coho for travelers, steelhead when the law allowed, and herring when times were narrow. We mended nets for cash and credit. We did not grow wealthy. We stayed exact. The day the trade closed was October 3, 1942. I write the date so no one can make it vague. The war had taken young men, gasoline, patience, and finally the right to continue as we had. A federal inspector came with county men after a shipment spoiled in another shed farther upriver. Not ours, but fear does not read labels well. They cited venting, drainage, and wartime sanitation orders. Some rules were sensible. Some were merely heavy. I had no money to rebuild to their measure, and my husband's hands were gone to the shipyards by then, working 12-hour shifts with a cough that never left him. I closed the door, salted what could be saved, and told myself it would be for one season. It became more than 30 years. In those years, I lost my husband, Peter, not to battle but to the work that feeds battle. I lost my brother Samuel in France in 1918. Near the end of the Great War, after he had written home that mud could swallow a boot and a prayer together. I lost my son David in Korea in 1951, a hill with a number instead of a name. The medal in this box belonged to Samuel. David's letters are buried elsewhere, under a stone his father set before he died. Some grief must remain in the ground. If you have found the tools, do not polish them before you understand them. The boning knife is for clean work only. Keep the angle low and let the blade follow the rib bones. The copper thermometer reads 2 degrees high, remember that. For a cold cure, use 3 parts coarse sea salt to 1 part brown sugar by weight, and 1 spoon of crushed juniper for every 10 pounds of fish. For winter salt salmon, rub gently. Never press hard, and keep the flesh between 34 and 38 degrees for 36 hours. Rinse in cold water, then dry on racks until the surface becomes tacky and your finger lifts without wet shine. That skin is called the pellicle. Do not smoke before it forms. For alder smoke, begin at 90 degrees with the vent half open for the first hour. Raise to 120 for 2 hours. Then hold between 140 and 150 until the thickest portion reaches 135 inside. If you want keeping fish, go slower and drier. If you want Sunday fish, let it remain soft enough to flake under a fork. Cedar is not for heavy smoke. Use cedar for the room, for racks, for memory. Use alder for the fire. Maple when you can get it, and never pitchy wood. The salometer will tell you what the tongue forgets. Brine for herring should float a clean egg to the size of a nickel above the surface. Brine for salmon bellies should be stronger. Change the brine if it clouds. Wash your hands before touching any cured flesh. Wash the table with boiling water and vinegar. Trust your nose, but do not make it do all the work. I hid the money because I had no daughter to give it to and no son left to receive it. Banks fail. Men argue. Papers disappear. And a woman's work is often treated as household clutter once she is dead. Salt keeps what it is asked to keep. Oak keeps its counsel. I place these things where only a patient person would find them, and where a hurried one would curse the weight and walk away. Inheritance is not the same as ownership. Ownership says, "This is mine." Inheritance says, "I have been trusted for a while." If you spend what is here, spend slowly and only to make the roof whole, the fire safe, the floor honest, and the door able to close against weather. Leave something for the one who comes after you, even if that person is not blood. Blood is not the only road by which a house returns to its people. There is a marker behind the smokehouse. Look for the walnut tree that grew around a horseshoe. My father nailed it there when my mother was carrying me, and the tree, being wiser than men, refused to let it go. Under that tree, you will find the place where Sinyi poured the first brine into the earth and asked that no hunger cross this threshold without being seen. Do not be ashamed if need brought you here. Need is an old boat. Many of us have crossed in it. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Marta Elise Halverson, Blind Slough, Clatsop County, February 12, 1976. Freya kept both hands on the page after the last line ended. The fire in the box had burned down to a blue thread, then to nothing. Cold took the room again, moving through the boards and around her ankles, but she did not reach for her coat. A drop from the roof landed in the metal pan. Another followed. The sound seemed farther away than it had before, as if the smokehouse had grown larger around one letter. She read the pages a second time. The first reading had been a door opening. The second was slower. She stopped where the names crossed water and years. She paused over the exact date of closing. She rested one finger beneath the instructions about temperature, ratios, pellicle, and alder, each word not romantic but useful, which made them almost unbearable. At the line about need being an old boat, she turned her head toward the south window and watched fog pass behind the glass. When she finished again, she folded the letter along its original creases. Not new creases. Not neater ones. The old folds knew the way. She returned it to the tin box but did not close the lid. Then she lifted the copper thermometer, held it near her face, and saw in its cracked glass the blurred reflection of her own eye, the workbench behind her, the pale room, the row of iron hooks waiting overhead. After a while, she took the map from under the quilt, placed the letter in the inside pocket of her coat, and went out the back door. The morning had turned colorless and still. No rain fell, though each branch held water at its tips. Behind the smokehouse, the ground sloped toward the slough in uneven shelves of grass, mud, and old oyster shell. The back door had opened only halfway because blackberry canes had grown into the threshold, so she stepped sideways, then used the borrowed chisel to clear a path. The walnut tree stood farther west than she expected. It was not the tallest tree in the row, but it had the broadest trunk, split into two main arms above shoulder height. Moss grew on the north side. A skirt of fallen leaves lay around its base, dark and slick from weather. Freya circled it once before she saw the iron. The horseshoe had not been nailed to the bark anymore. The tree had swallowed nearly all of it. Only the outer curve showed, black and rust-brown, emerging from the living wood like a memory the trunk had refused to digest. The ends were buried deep. Bark had folded around the iron in thick lips, sealing it there year by year, not rejecting it, not freeing it, simply keeping it. Freya set her palm against the tree below the horseshoe. The bark was cold and ridged. Water ran from a higher branch, struck her sleeve, and darkened the cloth. She stood very still. There was no stone marker, no carved board, no formal proof that anyone had poured brine here or asked hunger to be seen. Only the horseshoe, the slough, the tree, and a patch of earth where grass grew thinner than elsewhere. She knelt. With both hands, she cleared leaves from the base until she found old shells pressed into the soil, pale crescents half buried, some whole, some broken. Among them were charcoal flecks and small pieces of brick. Not a grave, not an altar. A working person's marker, made of what the hand had nearby. She did not pray in words there either. She placed 3 clean salt crystals from her coat pocket among the shells, then covered them with 1 leaf so the gesture would not announce itself to anyone but the ground. When she returned inside, the room seemed less abandoned than paused. She looked differently at the rods, the vents, the work table, the firebox. The building had not become safe. It had not become warm. It had not forgiven rot, mold, missing shingles, or legal trouble. But each damaged thing now stood in relation to a hand that had once chosen it. The oak vats were not debris. The racks were not skeletons. The cracked thermometer was not junk. Use had been interrupted. That was different from worth ending. In the lower drawer of the workbench, beneath the marble and the red pencil nub, she had found a candle on the day before but dismissed it as useless. It was wrapped in waxed paper, yellowed and stiff, tied with twine so brittle it had broken when she moved it. Now she took it out and examined it properly. It was beeswax, thick as her wrist, burned once at the top and then saved. The wick had blackened, but when she trimmed it with the pocket knife, pale fiber showed beneath. A scrap of paper had clung to the wrapping. She smoothed it with the back of her hand. Christmas candle, 1962. Save the end. Freya carried it to the firebox. She set the candle in the cast-iron trivet with the uneven legs and placed it on the hearth bricks. Not inside the fire, but just before the opening where its light could reach the room. She shaved a curl of cedar, lit it from a match Amos had tucked into the manual, and touched it to the wick. The candle resisted. The first flame guttered and died. She trimmed again, removing the blackened bead at the top. The second flame took shallowly, a small blue cup at the base, then rose yellow and straight. Beeswax softened at the rim and released a smell so faint she almost missed it. Honey, dust, and old summer fields. The light altered the smokehouse. It did not brighten it much. That was not its gift. It gave edges back to things. The copper thermometer shone. The metal darkened and warmed. Salt crystals caught brief fire along their planes. The bone netting needles lay pale as moon pieces on the bench. Shadows of iron hooks lifted along the wall and trembled when the flame moved. Freya sat on the floor before the hearth, knees drawn up, coat wrapped tight, and let the candle burn no wider than a hand's worth of light. Small kindnesses began arriving in the room, one by one, not as grand rescues but as objects placed where they had been needed. Ruth's quilt, folded under her at night and smelling of potatoes and church basement wax. The boiled eggs in the paper sack. Marjorie's red pencil circle on the map and the old photocopy she had not been required to give. Amos crossing out the pry bar and pretending ugliness made a tool free. Doris placing yesterday's coffee in her hand as if bitterness still counted as warmth. Even the boat repairman who had allowed her an hour to gather herself before the day began. None of those people had changed the whole road. Each had lit one board ahead. Viewer, before we go farther, I want to ask you to remember one small kindness you once received when you had no way to pay it back. Not the grand favor people mention at holidays. Something quieter. A ride in rain. A sandwich wrapped in paper. A stranger letting you sit in a warm room without asking for your history. A bill delayed. A door held open when your hands were full. Write it in the comments if you can. Someone else reading tonight may need to know that such things still happen, and that the smallest mercy can travel for years before it finishes its work. The candle burned lower. Freya rose only when the wax threatened to spill over the trivet. She pinched the wick with damp fingers and the smoke rose in a thin blue line, sweet and brief. Darkness returned, but not completely. Her eyes had learned the room. She closed the tin box, wrapped the letter once more, and placed it beside the tools under the driest portion of the workbench. The money case went beneath the loose floorboard she had found near the east wall, not hidden forever, only placed where a passing eye would not meet it. The winter salt remained in the bucket, covered twice and lifted onto 2 bricks so damp from the floor would not climb into it. Then she made her bed with more care than the bed deserved. Cardboard first, then quilt, then coat folded at the shoulder to keep the draft from the door off her neck. She placed the copper thermometer, the netting needles, the salometer, and the boning knife inside the canvas tote, not from fear alone, but because they had become a kind of company. The metal she wrapped in cloth and set near her hand. The letter, refolded along its patient lines, she kept inside her coat pocket. She lay down slowly. Through the broken roof, the night showed itself in one narrow strip. No stars were visible. Only fog, pale and moving. A drop fell from the ridge into the pan. The sound no longer seemed like failure. It was only the roof naming what must be done. Freya closed her eyes with the heirlooms beside her, and for the first time since she had entered the smokehouse, her hands opened in sleep. On December 3, the first snow came in before daylight, soft at first, then steady enough to make the marsh disappear. By 7, 3 inches had gathered on the collapsed lean-to and along the walnut limbs. By noon, there were 5.5 inches on the lane, though the wind had combed some places bare and piled others high against the north wall. Snow changed the sound of the smokehouse more than rain did. It softened the road, muffled the dog's bark, silenced the reeds, and laid a patient weight across the damaged roof until the broken cedar shingles began to complain. Freya stood inside with the repair manual open on the workbench, reading Chapter 2 for the 3rd time. The chapter was called Roof Framing and Temporary Weather Protection. It was written by someone who believed a frightened person could become competent if the instructions were exact enough. She read the warning about not stepping on unsupported sheathing. She read the diagram of rafters, ridge boards, collar ties, purlins, and decking. She traced the little drawing of a sister rafter with one cold finger, then looked up at the roof seam where daylight came through in a ragged line. She had already measured from below using cotton rope knotted at 1-foot intervals. The building was 30 feet and 4 inches long by 18 feet 2 inches wide, wider at the front than the rear by almost 3 inches because the west wall had begun to lean. The damaged roof area ran 14 feet along the ridge and nearly 6 feet down the north slope. The manual said temporary patches should overlap sound roofing by at least 12 inches, and permanent repair required cutting back to firm decking, not simply covering weakness with hope. Hope was not a roofing material. She wrote the calculation twice. Cedar shingles would have been proper, but cedar cost too much and required more time than the forecast allowed. Amos priced 3-tab asphalt shingles for the worst section at 13 bundles if she repaired only the broken run, more if she stripped the full north slope. Roofing felt, 1 roll. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, 5 pounds. 2x6 lumber for sister rafters, 3 lengths of 16 feet, because the cracked rafters could not be trusted to carry snow. 1 bundle of lath to use as temporary battens. A chalk line. Tar paper. A tube of roofing cement. A second tarp, heavier than the first, for nights. Amos let her stand at the hardware counter while he did the arithmetic on his yellow pad. 13 bundles is too much for that roof line, he said. The manual says 1 bundle covers about 33 square feet. On a roof drawn by a sober man with square corners. She looked at him. That roof is neither sober nor square. He crossed out 1 line, added another, and stared toward the window where snow moved past the hardware sign. Behind him, nail bins smelled faintly of oil and iron. The stove in the corner ticked with heat. You need 11 bundles for the broken side if you do not waste. You need 3 sheets of 1/2-inch plywood for the worst decking. Maybe 4. Felt roll. Nails. Cement. Flashing patch near the chimney if you can get that far. I cannot carry that. No. You cannot. He walked to the back room and returned with an object wrapped in an oil-dark rag. When he unfolded it, a roofing hatchet lay in the cloth, its steel head scarred, 1 edge sharpened, the other shaped for pulling nails. The handle was hickory, dark from years of palms. My brother used this, Amos said. He roofed half the barns between here and Napa before his knees quit. He died owing me $12 and a fishing reel, so I reckon the hatchet is still in dispute. Freya did not reach for it. I cannot buy that. I did not price it. The bell over the door rang then, letting in snow and a man in a green wool coat with tar on 1 sleeve. He was short, broad through the chest despite his age, and moved with a sideways caution that suggested 1 hip had made terms with pain. His hair was white under a knit cap. His nose had been broken once, maybe twice. He stopped when he saw the hatchet on the counter. That Owen? Amos nodded. Slough roof, he said. The man looked at Freya with pale eyes set deep beneath snowy brows. You the one bought that? Yes, sir. How many rafters gone? At least 2 cracked. 1 split near the bird's mouth. I have not seen the ridge from above. You go up there alone. You will come through it. Amos poured coffee from a metal pot into a chipped mug and handed it to the man without asking. This is Silas Rook, he said. He used to roof when his knees were still speaking English. Silas snorted. They still speak. Mostly profanity. Freya waited. She had learned not to fill pauses that belonged to other people. Silas took 1 swallow of coffee, winced at the taste, and set the mug down. I do not take pay, he said. I did not ask. That is why I am saying it early. By afternoon, Silas had walked the lane with her in the snow, carrying the roofing hatchet inside his coat as if it were a living thing that disliked weather. He inspected the roof from the ground first. Then he leaned Amos's borrowed ladder against the south wall where the roof was sounder and climbed 3 rungs, no higher, using a hooked cane to probe the damaged shingles. That ridge is tired, he said. Not dead. Tired. For the next 11 days, the roof governed everything. Silas came at 8 each morning, except one day when sleet made the road glass and Amos sent a message through the diner that only fools climbed wet roofs. Silas brought no conversation beyond instruction. He wore fingerless gloves, a patched canvas coat, and boots with soles that gripped frost better than Freya's shoes gripped anything. He taught from the ladder, from the ground, and, twice, from the roof itself, moving on boards laid across rafters so weight spread where the old structure could receive it. "Hand me the line." She handed him the chalk line. "Not there. There." He snapped a blue line across the plywood patch, the sound sharp in the cold. "Cut to the line." "Not near it." She cut slowly, using Amos's handsaw, the plywood clamped against two sawhorses built from scrap. Snow fell into her hair. Her fingers numbed, then hurt, then became useful again. Silas watched the saw wander half an inch and tapped the board with his cane. "You are arguing with it." "I am trying to keep it straight." "Then stop pushing." The sister rafters came first. Silas showed her how to set a new 2x6 alongside the cracked rafter, matching crown to crown, bearing cleanly at the top and bottom. They jacked the sag no more than half an inch, with a bottle jack borrowed from Amos and a post cut to length, because lifting an aged roof too quickly could split what remained. They clamped the new rafter in place, drilled pilot holes, and fastened it with 3/8-inch carriage bolts staggered every 24 inches, washers under both nut and head. "Do not make a ladder of holes," Silas said. On the fourth day, they replaced the rotten decking. The cedar beneath the broken shingles came away in damp handfuls near the ridge, black at the edges where water had traveled. Freya carried each ruined piece down the ladder and stacked it by the lean-to for later burning if it dried enough. The new plywood smelled raw and pale against the older wood. It looked wrong for a day, then felt paper covered it, and its wrongness became part of the repair. Nailing became its own lesson. Silas would not let her hammer carelessly. 3 strokes, he said. Set. Drive. Seat. A nail proud by even 1/8 of an inch could lift a shingle. A nail driven too deep cut the mat and made a future leak. That nail's proud. Freya pulled it. Again. She set another. 2. She looked at him, breath showing white. You buried the head. Pull it. She pulled it. The rhythm entered her arm slowly. Set. Drive. Seat. The roofing hatchet was lighter than it looked and less forgiving than a hammer. Its claw bit under old nails. Its blade trimmed shingles at the rake. By the 7th day, the handle had rubbed a new blister below her thumb. By the 9th, the blister had hardened. By the 10th, she no longer looked at each nail after driving it. She could feel when the head sat true. At noon, Doris sent soup in a jar through Silas. Though Silas claimed he had found it on the road and could not be responsible for abandoned soup. Amos delivered the last bundle of shingles in the back of his pickup and said nothing about the account. The older man in the brown cap from the White House stopped once at the mailbox bank, watched them working, and left a coil of used rope by the lane without knocking. On December 14, the patched roof held under a night of rain. On December 15, Silas came at 8, climbed only 2 rungs of the ladder, looked along the roofline, and nodded once. That will shed water. It was not praise. It was better. Freya stood in the yard, snowmelt dripping from the new shingles into the mud at her feet. The repaired section did not make the smokehouse beautiful. It made it less doomed. Above the workbench, daylight no longer fell through the seam. The metal pan sat dry on the floor where it had once collected the rhythm of every failure. Silas handed her the roofing hatchet. Keep it shut. It belongs to your brother. He is beyond roofs. She held it with both hands. Inside, The smokehouse smelled different after the roof work. Still of cedar and salt, still of damp boards and ash, but no longer of open weather. A repaired roof does not make a home. It makes a promise to everything underneath. January entered through the bricks. The roof no longer gave way, and so the chimney announced itself more plainly. During the last week of December, while rain thawed snow from the ditches and turned the lane into a brown ribbon, Freya found powdered mortar on the firebox lip each morning. At first, it was only a pale dusting, easy to brush aside. Then a flake of brick face came loose from the left cheek of the firebox and fell whole onto the hearth, thin as a dried apple slice. Spalling, the manual called it. Water entered brick, froze, expanded, and broke the fired face away little by little. Mortar joints powdered when lime had leached out or when old repairs had been made with cement too hard for soft brick. The book spoke sternly against smearing new material over rotten joints. Decayed mortar had to be raked out to sound depth, brushed clean, dampened, and repointed with a mix compatible with the original work. Compatible. The word mattered. Amos confirmed it while weighing out supplies on the hardware scale. "That chimney is likely soft brick," he said. "You put hard Portland cement against it. The brick breaks before the joint does. Use lime. Give it room." He sold her a small bag of hydraulic lime, a scoop of fire clay from an open sack, and sharp sand measured into a paper feed bag. The mix he wrote on the yellow pad was 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, and half part fire clay for the firebox joints nearest heat. For exterior repointing above the roofline, 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, no fire clay unless the brick demanded it. Work damp, not wet. Pack deep. Strike the joint. Cure slow. Keep it above freezing if you can. How? You cannot always. That is why January teaches humility. For 3 weeks, the chimney became a narrow country of patience. Freya worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s, sometimes rising to 31 by mid-afternoon, then falling again as soon as the light left the slough. She hung a tarp inside the smoking chamber to trap a small measure of heat near the firebox, though she did not keep a full fire while mortar cured. She warmed bricks with a lantern placed safely at a distance. She kept mixing water in a tin near her body so it would not chill too fast. When the air grew too cold, she stopped, because bad mortar placed bravely was still bad mortar. First, she raked. The proper joint raker cost more than she wanted, so Amos lent her one with a handle worn smooth and a blade shaped like a tiny hook. She scraped out old mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch where it was weak, sometimes deeper where powder continued under pressure. The dust was pale gray, gritty, and dry despite the damp air. It gathered in the lines of her palms. She used the wire brush after raking, then a small paintbrush to clear the last grains from the joint. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb. Gloves were too clumsy for the fine work of packing mortar into narrow seams, so she worked barehanded in short intervals. 15 minutes with the pointing trowel and hawk, then hands under arms, then breath into cupped palms, then back to the wall. The first few days, she cursed once under her breath and looked around as if Ingrid might object. Later, she stopped wasting heat on words. The mortar had to be mixed in portions no larger than she could use before it stiffened. Sand first, lime, then fire clay for the inner joints, dry mixed until the color evened. Water added slowly, not poured in a hurry. The right texture held on the trowel without slumping and pressed into the joint like firm butter. Too wet, and it smeared. Too dry, and it crumbled. She learned by error. The first batch fell out of the joint in 3 sad clumps because she had not dampened the brick. The second smeared across the face and had to be brushed away after it thumbprinted. The third held. By the 4th day, she could pack the back of the joint, then the middle, then the face, pressing each layer firmly so no hollow remained. She struck the joints with a bent piece of copper wire Amos found in a drawer, leaving a shallow concave line that shed moisture and looked modest beside the aged brick. Silas came once to look and said, "Too pretty." She looked at the wall. "Is that bad? Chimneys do not need embroidery." So she made the next joints plainer. On the exterior, above the roof patch, the work was harder. Amos would not let her climb alone. Silas came back for 2 afternoons, not to do the repair, but to hold the ladder and criticize her balance. The chimney rose only 5 feet above the roof, but from up there the marsh looked broader, the slough darker, and the ground too far away for comfort. She chipped loose mortar with slow taps, brushed the joints, sprayed them lightly with water from a bottle, and packed lime mortar while wind tried to take feeling from her hands. "Keep 3 points," Silas said. "I am. Thinking about it is not doing it." She shifted one knee against the roof board. At night, she covered fresh work with damp burlap and then a loose layer of cloth to slow the cure. The manual said lime wanted time and moisture. It hardened not by defiance but by taking carbon back from the air, returning slowly toward stone. That pleased her more than it should have. Even mortar, if properly mixed and kept from frost, could become itself again by breathing. Late January brought a clear day with a hard blue sky and frost white along every reed. Freya inspected the chimney after breakfast. The joints had cured firm. The spalled bricks remained scarred but stable. The firebox lip had been reset. The clean-out door opened and closed without shedding grit. She waited until the temperature rose above freezing, then laid a test fire no larger than 2 cupped hands. Cedar shavings, alder twigs from a fallen branch. 3 dry sticks Amos had given her from a scrap bin. She lit the fire and watched. The smoke rose at once. Not sideways. Not into the chamber. Up. Through the throat. Into the flue. Out beyond the new mortar and repaired roofline. She went outside and stood in the yard looking at the chimney against the clear afternoon. Smoke lifted in a thin, blue-gray line and moved cleanly over the roof. The sight was so modest that anyone passing on the road would not have slowed. Freya stood until the smoke thinned and vanished into the cold air. Then she returned inside, warmed both hands near the brick, and made broth from water. 1 onion Doris had left in a bag, and the last heel of bread toasted directly on the trivet. The chimney did not roar. It breathed. That was enough. The floors waited until the chimney stopped shedding dust. By then, Freya knew the boards by voice. The one near the east wall clicked before settling. The board in front of the workbench gave a dry, high note. The dangerous place between the front room and smoking chamber had grown worse after weeks of damp weather, and she had stepped around it so often that her body made the turn without thought. Avoidance had become a path. Repair required breaking that habit. The front room floor was mostly white pine, not cedar, as she had first believed under grime and salt dust. Amos confirmed it when she carried in a splinter. "Pine," he said. "Old growth. Tight grain. You do not get boards like that from the yard now unless you rob a church." The planks were wide, some 11 inches, some closer to 13, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose square shoulders caught light when cleaned. Several boards were cupped. 2 near the door had rot along the ends. One by the workbench had split down the middle but could be saved with a cleat beneath. The bad passage board, when she finally pried it up with Silas watching, revealed a joist darkened at the top but sound below. Water had gathered there, not long enough to destroy, only long enough to warn. "Scab it," Silas said. "Sister? For a joist this short, scab is enough. Sister if you want to flatter it." They fastened a 2x4 repair alongside the weakened area, using construction screws Amos allowed on the account after explaining that faithfulness to old methods did not require foolishness where hidden strength mattered. The lifted board went back down with its original nails where possible. Where the rose heads had broken, Amos found square-cut replacements in a coffee can labeled Old Stock, priced at 10 cents a handful. The sanding frightened her more than the chimney. The chimney could be approached joint by joint. A floor became one surface, and a wrong pass could scar what a century had kept. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day from a shop near town, plus a deposit Amos quietly covered and wrote nowhere. It came in a cracked black case with a cord repaired by electrical tape and a warning printed near the switch about dust collection. "You keep it moving," Amos said. "Do not park it. You park it, you make moons." He sold her discs in 3 grits. 80, 120, 220. Coarse enough first to remove grime. Raised grain, stains, and old finish. Medium to refine. Fine to quiet the surface without making it slick as furniture. She bought fewer discs than recommended and regretted it by the second hour. Before sanding, she set every nail head below the surface with a punch and mallet. Tap. Check. Tap. Check. Some nails refused. Some sank cleanly. One rose head split under the punch and had to be pulled with the roofing hatchet claw, leaving a dark square hole she filled later with pine dust and glue. Made from hide granules Amos had on a back shelf because, he said, every hardware store should contain at least 3 things no one had asked for in years. She hung cloth in the doorway to the smoking chamber. She opened both south windows where glass remained and covered the broken panes with burlap to keep snow from entering. Then she put on the dust mask, set the first 80 grit disc, and switched on the machine. The sound filled the smokehouse like an angry hive. At first, she moved too slowly. The sander tugged and spun against the grain, leaving pale circles. She stopped, breathed through the mask, and began again with longer passes, overlapping by half, working board by board from the far wall toward the door. Dust rose despite the little collection bag. It coated her sleeves, lashes, eyebrows, and the line where her hair escaped its pins. The floor changed under the machine, not quickly, but visibly. Gray lifted. A honeyed color appeared, dark in the grain lines, pale on the ridges. The first pass took almost the whole day. By evening, her wrists shook when she lifted the water bottle. The room smelled of pine resin released from deep time, sharp and clean beneath the older salt. She swept, vacuumed with Amos's borrowed shop vac, then wiped the boards with a barely damp cloth, watching hidden figures emerge in the wood. Knots like closed eyes, dark streaks where old moisture had traveled, nail rows as straight as stitching. The second day, she used 120 grit. The sander fought less. The floor no longer looked rescued from dirt but from forgetting. She moved more confidently, though never fast. Once, Doris appeared at the door with a paper bag and stood watching for half a minute while the machine wound down. "You look like a miller's ghost," Doris said. Freya pulled down the mask. "I feel worse than that." "Then eat before you vanish." Inside the bag were 2 slices of meatloaf, cold potatoes, and a piece of gingerbread wrapped in wax paper. Freya ate sitting on the step, feet in the snow-mudded yard, while dust settled behind her in the room like pale weather. The third pass, 220 grit, was almost tender. It did not remove so much as refine. The boards grew smooth under her palm without losing the slight unevenness that told of hand planes, winter swelling, and long use. After vacuuming twice, she wiped every board with mineral spirits Amos had measured into a jar and watched the color deepen for a moment before drying back. Dark honey, then amber. Along the grain, when light came low, a mahogany warmth appeared that seemed impossible in the cold room. Finish came in 3 coats. Amos advised tung oil cut with citrus solvent for the first coat, then a blend of tung and linseed for the second, and a final thin coat hand-rubbed after 48 hours of cure. Pure Romance would have chosen only old methods, he said, but Pure Romance did not stand up to wet boots. She followed the ratios written on the jar. First coat, 1 part tung oil to 1 part solvent, flooded lightly and wiped after 30 minutes. Second coat, 3 parts tung to 1 part boiled linseed oil, wiped thinner than hunger wanted. Third, nearly straight oil, rubbed with cloth until the surface held a low sheen. The waiting was harder than sanding. 48 hours between coats meant she could not live carelessly on the floor she had just saved. She laid planks across safe paths. She slept in the smoking chamber near the firebox, where the brick floor held cold but no finish. She kept the room ventilated despite winter air because the manual and Amos both warned that curing oil needed breath and oily rags could combust if bald and forgotten. She hung each rag outside over the lean-to rail, stiffening in frost like flags of caution. Then came the bad morning. It was January 29. Rain had frozen in the night, and the walnut branches clicked against one another when the wind moved. Freya woke with her throat raw, her hands swollen, and a heaviness through the ribs that made even sitting up feel like lifting a wet net. The second coat had cured. The third waited. The manual lay open. The sander had been returned. The account had grown. The roof still needed more work beyond the patch. The windows were broken. The back wall leaned. There were legal notices she did not understand tucked in the blue folder. She stood, took 1 step toward the workbench, and stopped. No dramatic collapse came. No tears. No spoken despair. Only her body refusing the next motion with a calm more final than pain. She put on her coat and walked to the marsh. A great blue heron stood where the slough narrowed, near a shelf of mud uncovered by the tide. Freya lowered herself onto a fallen cedar log slick with moss and sat with both hands tucked under her arms. The heron did not move for so long that time seemed to gather around it. Rain misted her face. Cold entered through the seat of her skirt. Somewhere behind her, the smokehouse waited with its half-finished floor and rows of tools set in order. She did not work that day. The heron struck once, missed, and returned to stillness without shame. Toward evening, Freya went back inside, ate cold potatoes from a bowl, and slept before dark. In the morning, she rubbed the final coat into the pine by hand, slowly enough to feel every saved board receive it. February light exposed the windows. During storms, she had covered them with feed sacks, cardboard, burlap, and 1 square of cloudy plastic Amos found behind his paint shelf. Those coverings kept out the worst rain, but turned daytime into a dim brown compromise. Once the roof patch held, the chimney breathed, and the floor had cured under its 3 coats, the windows became impossible to ignore. They were the building's eyes, and most had been blinded badly. There were 8 in all. 3 had no glass left, only muntins with jagged teeth at the corners and old glazing putty hard as bone. 4 were cracked in different ways, 1 diagonal line from corner to corner, 1 star break near the latch, 1 pane split cleanly in 2 but still clinging to the putty, 1 with a hole the size of a fist where wind entered with personal interest. The 8th window, on the south wall above the workbench, was different. The glass in that pane was wavy, faintly green at the edge, with bubbles and distortions that bent the walnut branches outside into watery shapes. On the lower rail, under layers of grime, someone had scratched 1888, not neatly, but with enough intention to remain. The sash was weathered. The putty was failing, but the glass itself was whole. Amos came to look at that one when she asked about replacement. He leaned close, breathed on the corner, wiped a circle with his thumb, and shook his head. You do not replace that. It leaks. Then you repair around. I do not know how. That is different from replacing. He sold her DAP 33 glazing putty, glazier's points, a narrow putty knife, boiled linseed oil for priming dry rabbits, 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and enough salvaged glass from his back room to cut new panes for the missing windows. The salvaged glass did not match perfectly. Some was clearer, some slightly rippled, 1 piece taken from an old storm door and bearing scratches near the bottom. Amos said a working building was allowed to show where help had come from. Window work required a different patience than roofs or mortar. It was smaller, quieter, and no less exact. She removed the first sash by prying off the interior stop with the putty knife and a thin wedge, marking each piece with pencil so it could return to the same place. The sash cord had snapped years earlier, leaving the counterweight hidden in the pocket. Amos had told her where to look. She unscrewed the little access panel in the jamb and reached into darkness until her fingers brushed cold iron. The counterweight came up heavy, cylindrical, and dust-coated. She tied the new cotton cord through its eye with a figure-8 knot, exactly as Amos had drawn on the counterpaper. Not a granny knot. Not a hopeful tangle. Figure 8. Dressed clean, tail long enough to trust. The cord ran over the pulley, down into the pocket, and onto the side of the sash where it fastened into the groove. When she lifted the sash after reassembly, it held halfway without dropping. She raised and lowered it 3 times just for the pleasure of honest balance. The broken glass came out slowly. Old putty had to be softened where possible, chipped where not. She worked the point of the knife under it, lifting in small flakes. Once, a piece of cracked pane shifted and sliced through the cuff of her glove without reaching skin. She stopped, wrapped the glass in newspaper, and carried it outside to a wooden crate marked sharp, because danger left casually becomes someone else's wound. Before setting new glass, she brushed the rabbit clean and primed the dry wood with linseed oil so it would not steal oil from the putty and make the repair fail too soon. She pressed a thin bed of DAP 33 along the frame, set the pane into it, and pushed glazier's points gently into the wood with the putty knife, 2 on each side for the smaller panes, 3 where the glass was taller. Then came the face putty, rolled between palms into a rope, pressed along the edge, and drawn smooth with the knife at a clean bevel to shed water. Her first bevel looked like a shoreline after storm. She scraped it off and began again. By the 3rd window, her hand understood the angle. The knife moved in one deliberate pull, corner to corner, leaving a sloped line that covered the glass edge without climbing too high. At the corners, she mitered with the knife tip. Not perfectly, but better each time. Putty collected under her nails and along the heel of her palm. Linseed oil darkened the sash. Glass caught the pale winter light and sent it into corners of the room that had not seen brightness since she arrived. The original pane above the workbench took a full day. She did not remove the glass. Instead, she worked around it with the care of a person mending skin over an old scar. The failed putty came away in reluctant fragments. Beneath it, the wood was dry but not rotten. She brushed it clean with a soft paintbrush, touched the rabbet with oil, and pressed new putty along the edge without forcing the glass. The waviness in the pane made outside trees tremble even when the air was still. Each time she glanced through it, the world looked older and less certain, which seemed proper. Doris came that afternoon with a bag of onions and stood beneath the window while Freya worked. "That glass makes me seasick," she said. "It is stained." "Did I say take it out?" "No. Mom." She left the onions on the bench and departed before gratitude could make either of them uncomfortable. The last window was on the west wall, facing the slough. Its upper sash had been painted shut long ago, though most of the paint had surrendered to weather. The lower sash was missing 2 panes, and the cord had broken on both sides. Freya opened the weight pockets, found one counterweight in place and the other lying at the bottom among mouse shells, then rethreaded both with cotton cord. Figure 8 knot. Over pulley. Seat the knot. Test the travel. Remove broken putty. Brush. Oil. Bed. Set. Point. Bevel. By then, the motions had become almost prayerful without becoming easy. Outside the window, on a walnut branch near the wall, a chickadee landed while she was smoothing the final line of putty. It was so near she could see the tiny black cap, white cheek, gray wing, and quick feet gripping the wet bark. The bird tilted its head and looked into the smokehouse through the new glass. Freya held the putty knife still. The chickadee flicked once, settled, and gave a small sound too thin to fill the room. Freya did not move until it flew. When the last pane was set, she stepped back and looked through all 8 windows in the late February light. None were grand. None were square in the way new windows pretend to be square. 3 held salvaged glass. 4 held repairs that would need paint when weather allowed. 1 held its old wavy pane and the scratched year beneath it. But the wind no longer entered by right. Rain struck glass and stayed outside. Light came through without bringing weather in its hands. She cleaned the putty knife, wiped the sash cords, and returned the cotton spool to the workbench. In the front room, the repaired floor held a low glow under the pale windows. The firebox breathed through repointed brick. The roof no longer counted rain aloud. On the workbench, the copper thermometer, bone netting needles, salometer, and boning knife rested in a row, waiting for a spring she had not yet earned. Freya stood among the finished windows until evening settled and the glass turned dark, reflecting the inside of the smokehouse back to her. Late February found the walls. For weeks, Freya had been careful not to look at them too long. Roof, chimney, floor, and windows had all made urgent claims, the kind of repairs a person could justify because water, smoke, rot, and wind did not wait politely. The plaster waited differently. It did not threaten all at once. It sagged in patches. It loosened near the chimney. It showed long hairline cracks above the workbench and a soft bulge under the north window, where years of damp had crept behind the finish coat and separated it from the lath. When she tapped with one knuckle, some places answered firm. Others sounded hollow. The original plaster was horsehair over hand-split oak lath, 3-coat work laid by someone whose trowel had known patience. Amos came to look on a morning when the slough fog lay so thick outside the new glass that the room seemed to float in milk. He stood close to the chimney wall, pressed his palm against the bulge, and listened when she tapped. 3 failed patches, he said. Here, here, and there, near the shoulder of the chimney. Can they stay? For a while. Not forever. That was the sort of answer that made repair feel like a moral matter. He showed her how to cut back only what had failed, not what looked merely aged. Good plaster, he said, should not be punished for standing longer than anyone expected. She used the utility knife to score the edges in straight lines, then the putty knife and small pry bar to loosen broken plaster from the lath beneath. The failed sections came down in heavy curved pieces. Gray at the back, hair fibers still visible where the lime had held them. Behind them, the oak lath appeared, narrow strips split by hand and nailed with tiny cut nails, each gap waiting to receive the new scratch coat. The hardware store still had 1 paper sack of horsehair plaster fiber in the back room, left from the 1950s and kept because Amos disliked throwing away anything that had not yet failed its purpose. Do not breathe the dust, he said. I know. You know a great many things after you have almost done them wrong. He gave her lime, sharp sand, a smaller measure of gypsum for setting where needed, and a bundle of horsehair tied with twine. The mix for the scratch coat was coarse and fibrous, enough hair to bridge and bind, enough body to push through the lath and mushroom behind it in keys. Brown coat thicker, smoother, 3/8 of an inch. Finish coat thin, 1/8. Lime putty worked until creamy and laid with a trowel held flatter than fear wanted. Scratch first. She dampened the lath with a brush so dry oak would not steal water too quickly. Then she pressed the horsehair mortar through the gaps with a small plastering trowel, forcing it deep enough to curl behind the strips. It took strength and restraint together. Too little pressure and no key formed. Too much and old lath flexed where it should not. She scored the surface with a combed edge Amos had made from scrap tin, cross-hatching shallow lines so the next coat could grip. The scratch coat looked rough, almost ugly, but honest. It cured for days, protected from freezing by a small fire and old cloth hung near the chimney wall to prevent drafts. Freya touched it each morning with the back of a finger, feeling dampness leave by slow degrees. When it held firm, she mixed the brown coat, richer in sand, less hairy, and laid it to 3/8 of an inch, using a straight board as a screed where the wall needed to meet the old surface. Her first pass dipped. Her second stood proud. She scraped both back and did them again. 72 hours for the brown coat. She wrote that on a scrap of paper and pinned it to the workbench. During those 3 days, she did not poke or hurry the wall. She sharpened the boning knife. She cleaned each smoking hook with a wire brush until iron showed through the black. She rewound the linen twine and sorted the salt crystals again into clean, cloudy, and unknown. A person waiting for plaster to cure could either grow impatient or become useful in smaller circles. On the 4th morning, the brown coat had lightened. She mixed the finish coat in the cleanest bucket. Lime putty worked smooth with fine sand, no larger grit to drag beneath the trowel. The layer went on thin, 1/8 of an inch, feathered into the old plaster with damp edges and a steady hand. When she drew the trowel over the surface, and the wall took the light without a ridge, she stood back and let out the breath she had been holding. The new patches were visible. They did not pretend otherwise. They were paler than the aged wall, smoother in places, rougher in others. Around the chimney, they looked like bandages laid neatly over an injury no longer bleeding. She touched one edge after it had set enough to receive the pressure. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it quietly, and the smokehouse took the words without answering. That afternoon, a weak sun appeared through the west window. It crossed the repaired plaster, touched the workbench, and rested briefly on the copper thermometer. The room had not become whole in any sudden way. It had become less broken by exact degrees. The smokehouse was not empty. It had been waiting. Doris began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before March had quite decided to arrive. At first, Freya tried to return them. She walked to the diner with 2 empty jars, washed and dried, and waited near the register while Doris poured coffee for 3 men in rain jackets and told one of them he could complain about the eggs after he learned to cook his own. The diner smelled of bacon, floor cleaner, coffee, onions, and old heat trapped in vinyl seats. A radio played low near the kitchen, mostly weather and ferry schedules. On the corkboard by the door were business cards, church notices, a missing tabby cat, and 1 handwritten card offering firewood delivery. When Doris finally turned, Freya placed the jars on the counter. "I need to pay you for what you have been leaving." Doris looked at the jars as if they had insulted her. "You need many things. That is not the same as me needing payment. I cannot keep taking food. You can if I keep leaving it." The 3 men at the counter grew interested in their coffee. Freya kept her hands on the jars. "I mean it." "So do I." Doris took 1 jar, inspected it for cleanliness, and set it behind the counter. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Freya looked at her. "What shop?" "The one you are trying not to call a shop because the word frightens you." The cook slid 2 plates into the pass-through window. Doris lifted them, set them before the men, and wiped her hands on her apron. "Now, take yourself home before the rain turns." After that, the bags came twice a week. Sometimes biscuits, sometimes soup in a jar, sometimes onion ends and carrot peels Doris claimed were waste, though they were washed and trimmed too carefully for the lie to pass. Once, a small square of cake wrapped in wax paper appeared with no explanation at all. Freya stopped returning the bags empty. She folded them, smoothed them, and saved them in a drawer for future wrapping. Doris never crossed the threshold unless invited, and even then she stood near the door as if respecting the smokehouse's illness. She commented only on practical matters. "Your stove smoke smells bad. Those windows stopped rattling. That step will catch somebody's toe." Each sentence became a small inspection, not praise, never pity. She had a way of refusing ceremony that made help easier to receive. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a blue Schwinn bicycle lying in the mud behind him. He was perhaps 16, though his wrists and neck had the unfinished look of a boy still growing into his own bones. His hair stuck out beneath a stocking cap. A red scarf had been wrapped twice around his throat. The bicycle had a wire basket tied to the handlebars with shoelace. In the basket were 2 apples, a roll of electrical tape, and a schoolbook swollen from rain. Freya found him standing beside the woodpile, staring at the unsplit rounds Amos had dropped off from a fallen altar. "Can I help you?" He shifted them all. "I am here to split." "Who sent you?" "My mother said." "That does not answer much." He shrugged and looked toward the slough rather than at her. "About your grandfather." The word settled oddly. Freya did not correct him. She did not know how much of the old story had traveled through neighbors, clerks, diners, and hardware counters, changing shape with every mouth. Perhaps anyone tied to the smokehouse had become somebody's grandchild by now. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask." He set the first round upright and split it clean with one strike that made the maul head ring against the chopping block. He was not graceful, but he had been taught. Feet wide. Hands apart, then sliding together. Let the head fall. Do not muscle what weight can do. For 2 hours, he worked without conversation. Freya stacked the split wood under the lean-to rail, bark side up where it could shed damp. Caleb split alder, then cedar scraps, then a stubborn knotty piece that took 6 blows and reddened his ears with irritation. When she brought water, he drank half and handed the bottle back with a nod. Only once did he speak more than necessary. My great-granddad used to bring nets here. To be mended? Maybe. Mom said he said the woman here fixed what men thought was finished. He lifted them all again. The sentence entered the woodpile and stayed. After that, Caleb came on Saturdays when school and weather allowed. Sometimes he brought his bike. Sometimes he walked, maul across his shoulder like a farm tool from an older century. He would not accept money, eggs, or coffee. Once, Freya wrapped 2 biscuits from Doris in paper and tucked them into his basket when he was not looking. The next week, he left a bundle of kindling tied with twine on the step, as if equal accounts mattered to him too. Reverend Boyd did not enter the story so much as pass along its edge. He walked the Slough road every morning at nearly the same hour. A tall, narrow man in a black coat turned green at the seams from age. His hat was brown felt, brushed carefully but losing its shape at the brim. He had a limp so slight it appeared only when he was tired, and he carried a walking stick polished by use rather than varnish. At the mailbox bank, he paused, looked down the walnut lane, and tipped his hat if Freya happened to be outside. For the first week, that was all. Then one morning, while she was carrying ash to the pit, he stopped at the end of the lane and raised 2 fingers from the stick. "Lord keep you steady." 4 words. He walked on before she could answer. After that, the words came every few days, always the same length, never the same arrangement. Mercy meet your work. Grace over the peace in your hand. He did not ask her to attend church. He did not ask about the debt, the deed, the money she kept hidden, or the work she did after dark. He did not offer advice about suffering, which made him rarer than many religious men Freya had known in shelters and basement suppers. He only passed in rain, frost, and fog, tipping his hat as if the smokehouse were already worthy of ordinary courtesy. One morning in March, he left a folded piece of paper tucked under a stone by the mailbox post. Freya found it when returning from the hardware store. Inside was a hymn page torn from an old book. Not for singing, perhaps, but because the backside was blank and he had written a single line there. Some doors reopen inward first. She placed it in the drawer with the marble and the red pencil nub. The supporting kindnesses did not gather into rescue. Nothing so easy happened. Doris could not repair the back wall. Caleb could not erase the account. Reverend Boyd could not make winter pass sooner. Yet each of them altered the weather around the work by 1 or 2 degrees. A paper bag on the step. Split wood stacked under cover. 4 words sent down a lane in fog. A life can freeze from the edges inward. It can thaw that way, too. The cellar waited until February 11 because Freya did not trust what she could not yet see. She had found the door in the back room during the inventory, half hidden behind fallen rods and a coil of ruined rope. It lay flat on the floor near the west wall, ring handle rusted down, edges sealed by dirt and old salt. At first, she marked it unknown and left it there. Roof first, fire first, floor first, windows first. The cellar belonged to the category of places where a person could break an ankle, meet standing water, or find rot holding up more than it should. By February 11, with the chimney safe and the roof patched, avoidance no longer looked like prudence. She cleared the area in the morning. The ring handle resisted until she soaked it with oil and worked it back and forth with the pry bar, lifting only after the hinges gave their first reluctant sound. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of stone, damp earth, and something mineral, but not decay. She held the lantern over the opening. 7 granite steps descended into a rectangular room, 12 feet by 15 feet, according to her later measurement with knotted rope. The walls were fieldstone, irregular and close-fitted, with lime mortar darkened by damp but mostly sound. The floor was not dirt, as she had expected, but stone laid flat, some pieces rough, some worn smooth in paths. Water had entered at times, leaving mineral lines along the lower wall, but the center stood dry. She went down 1 step at a time. The lantern light made the stones move in uneven shadows. On the 3rd step, her boot scraped something that shifted, but she was watching the floor below and did not stop yet. At the bottom, the air was colder but still. Shelves lined the east wall, some collapsed, some holding empty jars furred with dust. A crate marked with faded letters had rotted at one corner. Inside were corks, broken glass, and a ledger so eaten by damp that its pages had become one thick block. In the center of the cellar floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the surrounding stone. The slab was rectangular, smooth along the top, and set with deliberate care. At its center, shallow but visible under lantern light, was a carved mark, a salmon curve crossed by a netting needle and a small square that might have represented salt. A craft mark, a family mark, perhaps a maker's sign, perhaps something older than either. Freya knelt beside it and brushed grit from the carving. The slab had no ring, no obvious seam to lift, no instruction. It sat there with such calm authority that she understood, without deciding, that it was not for that winter. Some discoveries arrive with their own refusal. She did not pry at it. She did not strike it. She placed her palm once over the carved salmon, then stood. There was enough already. On the west shelf, she found 6 stoneware crocks, 2 cracked, 4 whole. On the north wall, iron brackets that might once have held rods or drying frames. In the corner, a stack of cedar boards raised on stones, surprisingly dry. She lifted one and found it sound enough to use for future shelves. The cellar was not a treasure room. It was more useful than that. It was a cool place, a keeping place, a place where summer heat would not ruin what winter work prepared. As she climbed out, her boot struck the 3rd step again. This time, she stopped. A small oak box had been wedged under the lip of the stair, not hidden deeply, but placed where only someone climbing slowly with a lantern might notice the squared edge against granite. It was no larger than a cigar box, dark with age, held shut by a brass hook. The wood had swollen but not split. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because some things should first return to light. On the workbench, under the repaired window, she lifted the hook. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was long, heavier than modern keys, its bow shaped like the same curved salmon mark carved into the cellar slab. Green tarnish had gathered in the grooves. Its teeth were simple but deep. There was no tag, no note, no lock name by any paper inside the box. The photograph was wrapped in cloth. When Freya unfolded it, the room narrowed. A young woman stood in front of the smokehouse in summer light. The building behind her was whole, shingles straight, signboard painted, windows shining. The woman wore a plain dark skirt, a white blouse with sleeves rolled to the elbow. and an apron marked at the hem. In her right hand, she held a netting needle. In her left, a salmon hung by the tail, silver side catching whatever sun had struck the plate. Her hair was pinned high. Her mouth was closed, but not stern. The face was not identical to Freya's. No face crosses a century without alteration. Yet the cheekbones, the eyes, the angle at which the chin met the throat, the guarded steadiness around the mouth, all of it made Freya set the photograph down and step back. She turned it over only after a long while. On the back, written in dark ink, were the words, Elise Signé Joseph, daughter of Signé and Thomas, age 25, summer of 1903. The name from the letter. The daughter of the first builders. Freya placed the tintype beside Ingrid's photograph from her tote. One image sepia and softened by paper. One metal, dark, and exact. Between them lay years, losses, changed names, marriages, records, and women who kept trades alive until no one thought to call them trades anymore. She did not know what the brass key opened. That fact mattered less than the fact that it had been kept. She carried it to the front room and set it on the mantel shelf above the firebox, where the repaired chimney bricks held a little warmth from morning. The key looked too formal for the rough shelf, but not unwelcome. The tintype she wrapped again and placed in the drawer with the letter copy, the hymn page, and the small objects that had begun forming a record of return. That evening, while rain tapped the new glass, she went once more to the cellar and stood above the granite slab. She did not go down. The lantern light from the open hatch reached only the first 2 steps. Below that, the dark waited without threat. She thought of the carved mark, the key, the photograph, the young woman holding both fish and tool, and the way some inheritances opened one room at a time. Then she closed the cellar door and set the ash shovel across it, not as a lock, only as a promise that she would not forget. Spring did not arrive all at once in Clatsop County. It retreated and returned, argued with rain, lost to frost, tried again. Snow withdrew first from the lane, leaving gravel, mud, and flattened grass braided with runoff. The creek beyond the walnut row grew loud with snowmelt, a narrow brown force hurrying toward the slough. Water filled ditches and moved beneath culverts with a voice larger than its size. Along the marsh, reeds stood broken from winter, but green showed at their bases if a person knelt low enough to see. By mid-March, walnut catkins hung from the branches like small green tassels. The chickadees came daily. The yellow dog began sleeping in the sun patch by the front step without asking permission. Caleb split less wood and carried more brush. Doris sent the first rhubarb stalks wrapped in newspaper and said they were too sour for weak characters. Reverend Boyd's morning prayers changed with the season. Light find your threshold. Freya painted the window putty only after it had skinned and cured enough to receive primer. She patched the step Doris had warned about. She built shelves in the cellar from the dry cedar boards, though she still left the granite slab untouched at the center. Amos showed her how to sharpen the boning knife on the old whetstone with oil and a low, steady angle. Silas came once, declared the roof patch ugly and functional, then stood beneath the walnut tree longer than necessary before walking home. The question of the craft pressed harder as the weather softened. The tools were clean. The chimney breathed. The windows held. The floor could be washed. The curing vat, emptied of its secret, had been scrubbed with hot water, vinegar, and a brush until the oak grain showed beneath years of salt. The winter salt had been sorted and stored in jars. The herbs remained fragrant when crushed. The instructions lay folded, known now almost by heart. Yet Freya did not begin that spring. Not properly. She stood one morning before the cleaned vat with the salometer in her hand and understood that hunger, gratitude, and inheritance were each capable of rushing a person toward damage. The letter had said not to waste on haste. A first full cure done badly would not honor anyone. It would only prove that longing could spoil fish as surely as heat. So she made a smaller decision. She would order modest materials with 1 coin, not from the sealed bills, not from the large bundles, but from a single common silver quarter whose face value she recorded and whose absence she marked. Alder chips. Food-safe paper. Clean salt for practice so the winter salt could be preserved until she knew her hand again. A small salmon fillet from a fisherman Doris trusted, not a whole side. She would practice on samples no larger than supper, keeping notes on temperature, texture, smell, pellicle, and smoke. She would not open a shop sign yet. She would not call herself restored. The first warm day of April, she carried a chair outside and sat under the walnut tree where the horseshoe remained held in living wood. The slough shone through reeds newly green at the tips. A heron crossed the sky, wings slow and prehistoric. Behind her, the smokehouse stood with patched roof, mended chimney, repaired windows, and walls that held the day's light in their uneven plaster. The brass key waited on the mantel. The cellar slab waited below. The tools waited on the bench. Freya placed both hands flat on her knees and listened to the creek running high with melted snow. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first true batch came from the smokehouse before dawn. The night had been clear and hard, the kind that silvered every fence wire and left the marsh grass edged with frost. Inside, the fire had been kept low and exact for hours, alder coals breathing beneath the iron grate, draft adjusted by the width of 2 fingers, thermometer checked and checked again. Freya did not trust memory alone. She trusted memory written down, tested, corrected, and made humble by use. The salmon had been rubbed the day before in the cold room, 3 parts coarse salt, 1 part brown sugar, juniper crushed under the flat of the knife, bay leaf broken by hand. It had rested at the proper temperature, rinsed clean, and dried on racks until the pellicle formed, tacky beneath 1 fingertip. No wet shine. She had begun at 90 degrees, raised slowly, held the smoke pail, and resisted the temptation to hurry when the thickest portion stalled below readiness. By morning, the fish had changed. Not merely cooked, persuaded. The surface shone deep amber, darker at the edges, with a thin line of fat beading where the heat had drawn it gently. When she lifted the first piece from the rack, it bent but did not break. The flesh parted under the knife in moist flakes, salt at the front, smoke behind it, sweetness only enough to round the tongue. She cut 1 narrow slice, placed it on a piece of rye bread, and stood by the workbench while winter light entered through the old wavy pane. She ate slowly. No one applauded. No bell rang. There was only the chew, the salt, the alder, the cold morning, and the quiet fact of a method returned through hands that had learned not to rush. The interior by then had settled into usefulness. The front room held 2 long work tables, 1 original and 1 built from salvaged fir, sanded smooth but left with knots visible. The repaired white pine floor had darkened under oil and boot traffic, honey in daylight, nearly walnut by lamplight. Shelves lined the east wall, each labeled in Freya's plain hand paper, twine, clean cloth, jars, alder, records. The smoking chamber had been lime-washed once, not to erase its age, but to brighten the walls and make cleaning more honest. The oak curing vat stood repaired on low blocks, iron hoops brushed and oiled, its hidden compartment empty now except for a copy of the letter sealed in waxed cloth. The money case was no longer under the floor. It rested in a locked cedar chest in the cellar, raised on stone, wrapped against damp, recorded in a ledger Freya kept with almost severe care. The winter salt occupied 3 blue-lidded jars on the highest shelf, where light did not reach. The tools hung above the workbench, not polished into prettiness, but cleaned, sharpened, and returned to use in ways that would not damage them. The metal remained wrapped except on dates when it had to be carried into daylight. The brass key waited longer than any practical person would have allowed. It sat on the mantel through one spring, one summer, one autumn, and most of the next year, its salmon-shaped bow-catching dust, then light, then more dust. Freya tried it in every lock she found. Front door, back door, cellar hatch, old trunk bought from an estate sale, a padlock on the lean-to that opened to nothing useful. None turned. At times she wondered whether its lock had been lost, burned, or swallowed by the county long before she arrived. The answer came because Caleb looked up. He had grown taller by then, though still not graceful with it. He came by on Saturdays when work allowed, no longer pretending he had been sent by his mother. That December afternoon, he was helping string a simple line of white bulbs along the porch roof, because Doris had said a business with no light looked like it owed money. Snow had fallen the night before, just enough to gather in the crotches of the walnut branches and along the lane. Caleb stood beneath the horseshoe tree, squinting upward. There is metal in there, too. Freya looked from the porch. The horseshoe. No. Higher. He pointed to a place above the swallowed iron, where bark had folded around a round discoloration about the size of a saucer. In summer, leaves had hidden it. In winter, with a branch bare in the low sun striking the trunk, a line showed, not natural. A seam, almost covered, but there. They brought the ladder. Freya climbed only high enough to reach the mark. Caleb held the rails without speaking. Under moss and bark lip, her fingers found the edge of a brass plate set into the trunk long ago, now grown nearly flush with living wood. At the bottom of the plate was a narrow keyhole, green with age and packed with dirt. She cleaned it with the point of a bone needle she no longer used for netting. The brass key fit. It did not turn easily. Nothing kept by a tree for decades would. She worked it with oil, patience, and small pressure until something inside gave a muted click. The plate loosened, then opened outward on a hinge so small and green it seemed more botanical than metal. Inside the tree was a cavity lined with tin. A folded cloth lay within, wrapped in oilskin that had cracked but held. Beneath it was a note in an envelope browned at the edges. Freya did not remove either while on the ladder. She passed them carefully down to Caleb, climbed to the ground, and stood under the walnut branches while snowmelt fell in slow drops around them. Inside the smokehouse, on the workbench, she opened the oilskin. The cloth was a folded United States flag with 48 stars, the fabric faded but intact, red stripes softened toward rust, white toward cream, blue field dark as deep water. It had been folded carefully, not in the tight triangle of later ceremony, but flat and square, as if stored by hands that wanted creases to be gentle. The note had been written in 1918, the year the Great War ended, in a hand different from Marta's but related to it by discipline. to the daughter who must keep what war cannot. Samuel's flag came home, though Samuel did not. I place it in the walnut because the house may burn, papers may scatter, and grief in drawers becomes too easy to open on ordinary mornings. Let the tree hold what the heart cannot carry every day. If a later daughter finds this, take it out when honor is needed, then put it where damp and forgetting cannot reach. Singe Ragnhild Sorensen Joseph. December 1, 1918. Freya read the note aloud once, because Caleb was standing there and deserved the sound of the words after being the one to look up. He removed his cap. She folded the note again along the worn lines and placed it beside Marta's letter. The flag she wrapped in fresh cotton and carried to the cedar chest in the cellar, not returning it to the tree. The walnut had kept it long enough. Some burdens, once found, should be brought indoors. The medal went to the cemetery on November 11. Not in spectacle. Not with an article in the paper. Freya placed it in her coat pocket before sunrise and took the bus as far as she could, then walked through damp fallen leaves to Ocean View Cemetery in Warrenton, where markers held names worn by salt air and time. Marjorie had helped locate Samuel's record in a county archive, and Reverend Boyd had found the section number written in a church memorial booklet from 1919. The grave stood beneath shore pines, modest, military stone pale against the wet grass. Freya did not leave the medal there. It did not belong to Weather. She unwrapped it, held it in both hands, and set it on the stone only long enough for the date to be met by daylight. Around her, Veterans Day flags moved in a light wind. A groundskeeper's cart hummed somewhere beyond the trees. Cars passed on the road without slowing. She read the name on the stone, then the year, then stood in silence until the cold entered her sleeves. Afterward, she wrapped the medal again and carried it home. That was how most things were handled now. Not displayed. Honored. Returned. The money changed less than some people might have imagined. Freya spent almost none of the old coins. 3 common silver quarters went first, each recorded by date, purpose, and reason. One bought alder chips and clean practice salt. One paid for glass after a storm cracked a salvaged pane in the lean-to door. One went toward a roll of butcher paper when the first small orders came, and the account had already stretched thin. Later, a worn mercury dime paid part of a postage cost because the woman at the counter could not stop admiring it, and Freya decided a little history could travel. The bills, after long advice taken carefully and never from anyone with hunger in their eyes, moved into a legal account protected for repairs, taxes, and future stewardship. She did not buy a car. She did not rent a bright storefront. She did not replace every scar in the smokehouse with new lumber. When the account allowed, she paid Amos in full, including the crossed-out items he had pretended not to count. He objected only once. "I know how to read my own ledger," he said. "So do I." He took the check, folded it once, and placed it under the counter without further speech. The rest remained sealed in purpose for the next one. Those were the words Freya wrote on the envelope that held copies of the records. The next one. Not necessarily a daughter. Not necessarily blood. Someone careful. Someone cornered. Someone who would understand that being trusted with a thing did not mean consuming it. The shop reopened without announcing itself. Doris did it. One Monday in early spring, Freya walked into the diner to return 3 jars and found an index card pinned to the corkboard by the door. The handwriting was Doris's, bold and impatient. Blind Slough smoked salmon. Small batches. Patient cure. Leave name at... No phone number. No price list. No claim of heritage large enough to embarrass the dead. Just the card, slightly crooked, held by a red pushpin under the lost cat notice and above a man offering mower repair. "You could have asked," Freya said. Doris refilled coffee at table 3. "I could have." By the end of the week, 7 names had been written in a little notebook kept beside the register. By June, there were 23. By the following winter, more than 40 people had asked to be called when a batch was ready. Teachers, fishermen, a librarian, 2 nurses, 1 retired ship pilot, Reverend Boyd, Marjorie. Silas, despite claiming smoked fish, gave him opinions, and Amos, who said he was ordering strictly for quality control. Freya kept the batches modest. Some weeks there were only 12 portions, some weeks none. She would not smoke in weather that would not let her hold temperature honestly. She would not stretch cure because demand had grown. She would not sell fish that would not have passed under Ingrid's hand or Marta's instruction. People waited. To her surprise, waiting made them more respectful, not less. The index card remained on the corkboard, grease-stained at one corner, edges curling. It was enough. Caleb returned with the sign in late summer. By then, he had finished high school and begun working part-time with a cabinetmaker in town. He rode up in the back of the cabinetmaker's truck, holding something wrapped in an old quilt. Freya was washing the work table after a morning batch when she heard tires in the lane and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Caleb jumped down, taller than the tailgate now, and carried the wrap board with both arms. "My mother said I should not bring it until I sanded the back too." "Your mother remains sensible. She said you would say that." He laid the board across 2 sawhorses in the yard and pulled away the quilt. The sign was cedar, hand-carved, the grain following the long line of the words. He had painted the letters deep blue, then rubbed the surface back so the color settled into the cuts instead of sitting brightly on top. At the left was the salmon mark from the brass key, copied with care but not perfectly, which made it better. The main line read Blind Slough Salt and Smoke. Below it, smaller, were 2 words that made Freya stop with the wet cloth still in her hand. And dog, plural. She looked at Caleb. He stared at the sign, not at her. "I know there are not daughters," he said. "I mean, not exactly. Mom said maybe that was the point." Wind moved through the walnut leaves. From the slough came the slap of a small wave against mud. The yellow dog, older and slower now, lay in the shade near the step and opened one eye. Freya touched the carved letters. The plural did not claim what was not known. It made room for what had been erased. Singy and Elise. Marta. Ingrid. Celia, too, though that thought had to stand at the far edge and wait without welcome or exile. Women who had learned, lost, carried, closed, hidden, and kept. Women whose names had traveled unevenly through paper, marriage, grief, and rumor. "How much do I owe you?" Caleb shook his head. "No. My mother said if you tried, I should say it is for the grandfather I got wrong." Freya stood with her hand on the sign. "You did not get him wrong in any way that mattered." He looked up then, and the boyish guardedness around his mouth shifted, not into a smile exactly, but into something that could become one if given privacy. They hung the sign that afternoon above the door, replacing the broken board that had once carried only 2 surviving letters. Amos came with proper screws. Silas held the ladder and insulted everyone's alignment. Doris stood in the yard with her arms crossed and said the blue was acceptable. Reverend Boyd passed at the road, tipped his hat, and offered 4 words. Bless every kept. The sign settled against the cedar front as if it had been absent. Not new. That autumn, Freya began writing her own letter. She did not begin because she felt finished. That would have been foolish. The roof would need full work within 5 years. The back wall still had a lean that required monitoring. The cellar slab remained unopened. Not from fear now, but because every life needs one door left for the proper season. The brass key had done its first work. Perhaps it would do more. Perhaps not. She began because the act itself belonged to stewardship. At the workbench, under the old wavy pane, she laid out paper, the red pencil nub from the drawer, Marta's letter, Signe's note, and Ingrid's photograph. She had bought a fountain pen from an estate sale, not costly, but solid, with a nib that required slower writing than a ballpoint. The first sheet took ink badly, feathering where the paper was cheap. She set it aside for lists and began again on better paper Amos ordered without comment. For a long time, she wrote only the opening. My dear one, whoever you are. The words looked different in her hand. Less upright than Marta's. Less severe than the labels. More open in some letters. Less confident in others. She did not try to copy. Copying would have been another kind of haste. Instead, she let her own hand confess its own weather. She wrote about arriving with nothing useful except the willingness to read instructions. She wrote about the $5 deed without making poverty noble. She wrote that hunger can sharpen attention but should not be mistaken for virtue. She wrote the roof measurements, the chimney mix, the floor grits, the window putty, the sash cord knots, the danger of oily rags, and the way alder smoke behaves differently when fog presses low against the marsh. She wrote Amos, Doris, Caleb, Marjorie, Silas, Reverend Boyd, Ruth, and the unnamed boat repairman into the record because houses are not restored by owners alone, no matter what deeds imply. She wrote about the money, what had been spent, what remained, and where records could be found. She wrote that no one should be ashamed to use what had been kept, but no one should use it quickly. She wrote that tools should be handled before being displayed, and that old salt should be tasted only after one had learned what ordinary salt can teach. When evening came, she sanded no boards, cut no fish, repaired no plaster. She only wrote until the lamp made a warm circle on the table and the window gave back her reflection with the room behind. Hooks, shelves, jars, sign shadow, chimney, tools, floor, the brass key on its hook, the photograph of Elise in summer light. Near the closing, she paused and listened. Rain had begun again, gentle against the roof. Not entering, only striking and leaving. The creek beyond the walnuts had lowered after summer, but the slough still moved with the tide, and the river beyond it still carried silt, ships, old losses, and weather toward the Pacific. The smokehouse held all of it quietly, salt and cedar, work and waiting, hunger and food, money kept, grief named, repairs visible, doors not yet opened. Freya dipped the pen. The smokehouse was not empty. It had been waiting. She let the ink dry before folding the page. Outside, the sign Caleb had carved moved slightly in the wind. Blind Slough, Salt and Smoke and Daughters. The words did not shine. They did not need to. In rain, in fog, In the blue hour before morning, they could be read by anyone who came close enough. A Salmon Smokehouse waits. It has always waited. In town, in the county clerk's office, Marjorie Klein kept one drawer more orderly than the others. Inside it were receipt tape rolls, paper clips, a rubber finger cone, 2 red pencils, and an envelope marked nuisance transfer. Old note. She had placed the $5 bill there after the transaction cleared, exchanging it quietly from her own purse so the original would not vanish into a deposit bag. The bill had softened at the fold from being carried through rain and hunger, then laid on a government desk with more hope than sense. Sometimes, when new clerks complained about old records, Marjorie opened the drawer to find a pencil and saw the envelope. She never took the bill out. She only touched the edge of it once in a while, then closed the drawer and returned to the counter, where people came needing paper to make room for the next hard mercy.